In 1867 Kansas, a widow who hadn't spoken in 2 years broke her silence with three desperate words that would change two broken lives forever. This is the story of Jonas Keller, a man rejected for being too heavy, and Eliza Brandt, a woman silenced by grief, who found each other when the world had given up on them both. Stay with me until the end of this journey, and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The Kansas sun beat down mercilessly on Cedar Junction Station that September afternoon in 1867, turning the wooden platform into a griddle that shimmered with heat waves. Jonas Keller sat heavily on his worn leather trunk, the only possession he'd brought from Pennsylvania, and read the telegram for the fifth time. His thick fingers trembled slightly as they held the thin yellow paper. Marriage canceled. Stop. You are too heavy for farm work. Stop. Do not come. Stop. 15 words. That's all it took to crush 3 months of hope. Jonas was a big man. There was no denying it. 6 feet tall and carrying well over 250 pounds on his broad frame. But he was strong too. He'd worked the steel mills in Pittsburgh for 12 years, hauling iron beams that would have broken lesser men. His arms were thick as fence posts, his shoulders wide enough to carry a full grain sack on each side. Yet here he was, rejected before he'd even been given a chance to prove himself. The station platform was mostly empty now. The other passengers from the westbound train had long since been collected by family or friends, leaving Jonas alone with his humiliation. The station master, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, kept glancing at him nervously from the ticket window, clearly wondering when this oversized stranger would move along. Jonas pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and mopped his forehead. The fabric was worn thin from years of use, but it had been his mother's before she died, and he couldn't bring himself to replace it. She'd have known what to say right now. She'd have put her small hand on his arm and told him that God had bigger plans, that this was just a detour, not a destination. But his mother was 6 years in the grave, and Jonas was alone. The mail order arrangement had seemed like divine providence when he'd first seen the advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Widow in Kansas seeking honest husband for companionship and farm partnership. Must be of good character and willing to work hard. Write to Mrs. Margaret Hutchinson, Cedar Junction, Kansas. He'd written immediately, pouring his heart into that letter. He'd been honest about his size, describing himself as a large-built man of considerable strength and gentle temperament. He'd told her about his steady work ethic, his skills with machinery and carpentry, his dreams of having land of his own. He'd even included a small daguerreotype, though he knew it wasn't flattering. Her response had been encouraging. She'd written back in neat, careful script that she valued honesty and hard work above all else. She'd described her small farm, 80 acres with a creek running through it, a sturdy house that needed some repairs, and fields that hadn't been properly worked since her husband died in the war. She'd said she was looking for a partner, not a hired hand, someone who would share in both the labor and the rewards. They'd exchanged 4 more letters over the following weeks. Jonas had saved every penny from his mill wages, sold what little furniture he owned, and bought his train ticket west. He'd dared to hope that maybe, finally, his life was beginning instead of just continuing. But Margaret Hutchinson had never seen him in person. And when he'd telegrammed from Chicago to confirm his arrival date, she must have had second thoughts. Maybe a friend had warned her. Maybe she'd shown his photograph around and folks had laughed. Maybe she'd just looked at that picture one more time and decided she couldn't do it. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. He was stranded in Kansas with $43 to his name and nowhere to go. You planning to sit there all day, mister? Jonas looked up to find the station master standing a few feet away, arms crossed over his narrow chest. I'm sorry, Jonas said quietly. I'll move along shortly. Train back east don't come through till day after tomorrow, the station master said, not unkindly. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Chen keeps clean rooms, reasonable rates. Thank you. Jonas stood slowly, feeling every one of his 34 years in his knees and back. The train journey had been long and uncomfortable, the seats too narrow for his frame. I appreciate the information. He hefted his trunk onto his shoulder. It weighed a good 80 pounds packed full, but he carried it easily, and started down the platform steps. The town of Cedar Junction spread out before him, a collection of wooden buildings lining a wide dirt main street. It looked like every other frontier town he'd seen from the train window, raw, hopeful, and slightly desperate. Hopeful, and slightly, the afternoon heat pressed down like a physical weight. Jonas made it halfway down the main street before he had to stop and set down his trunk. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, clinging to his broad back. He leaned against a hitching post and tried to catch his breath. That's when he saw her. She was standing across the street in front of the general store, partially shaded by the wooden awning. A woman, perhaps 30 years old, wearing a simple gray dress that had been mended in several places. Dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, pale skin that suggested she didn't spend much time in the sun. But it was her eyes that caught him, large, dark eyes that were staring directly at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Jonas nodded politely, the way his mother had taught him to acknowledge a lady, then picked up his trunk again. He needed to find that boarding house, get out of this heat, and figure out what to do with the wreckage of his plans. But as he walked, he could feel those eyes still on him. He glanced back once, and she was still there, still watching. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite read. Not pity, exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. He turned down a side street, following the station master's directions, and pushed the woman from his mind. He had enough to worry about without trying to decipher the stares of strangers. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a 2-story building that leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from standing against the Kansas wind. A small sign hung above the door, painted with careful English and Chinese characters. Jonas climbed the 3 steps to the porch and knocked. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked black hair and shrewd eyes that took in his size, his dusty clothes, and his obvious exhaustion in a single glance. "You need room," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. For 1 night, maybe 2. The station master said, "I know what he said. He sends everyone here." She stepped back to let him enter. $2 a night, includes breakfast and supper. You want bath? That's 25 cents extra. You pay in advance. Jonas set down his trunk in the narrow hallway and pulled out his wallet. The bills inside seemed thinner than they had this morning. He handed her $4.50. 2 nights, with baths, he said. Mrs. Chen counted the money carefully, then nodded. Room 3 upstairs, supper is at 6. You are late, you go hungry. No smoking, no drinking, no women in rooms. You break furniture, you buy furniture. Understand? Yes, ma'am. She handed him a key. Bathhouse is out back. You want bath now, I will heat water. That would be very kind, ma'am. Something in his voice, the exhaustion, the defeat, the barely maintained courtesy, made her look at him more closely. You come long way today, she said. Yes, ma'am, from Pennsylvania. Before that, Chicago. You have people here? Jonas hesitated. I thought I did. I was mistaken. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, and Jonas saw a flash of understanding in her eyes. She'd seen plenty of disappointed travelers, he supposed. The West was full of people running toward dreams and away from failures. Bathwater will be ready in 20 minutes, she said. You rest. Room 3 was small but scrupulously clean. A narrow bed with a quilt that had seen better days. A washstand with a chipped basin. A straight-back chair that Jonas eyed dubiously, wondering if it would hold his weight. A single window overlooked the back garden, where vegetables grew in neat rows and chickens scratched in the dirt. Jonas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and it creaked alarmingly but held. He pulled off his boots, his feet were swollen from the long journey, and lay back, staring at the ceiling. What now? He could take the train back east, return to Pittsburgh and the mills. But he'd burned those bridges pretty thoroughly. He told his foreman he was leaving for good, claimed his final wages, and said goodbye to the few friends he had. Going back would be an admission of defeat so complete that he wasn't sure he could bear it. Or he could stay out west, try to find work somewhere else. But doing what? Towns like this didn't need mill workers. They needed farmers, ranchers, men with skills suited to frontier life. Jonas was strong, and he wasn't afraid of hard work, but he didn't know the first thing about growing crops or raising cattle. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, someone was knocking on his door. Bathwater ready, Mrs. Chen called. Jonas splashed cold water on his face from the basin, then followed her directions to the bathhouse, a small wooden structure behind the main building. The copper tub was full of steaming water, and there were clean towels stacked on a bench. He stripped off his travel-stained clothes and lowered himself into the tub. The water came up to his chest, and the heat immediately began working on his sore muscles. For the first time since receiving that telegram, Jonas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. He scrubbed himself thoroughly with the rough soap provided, washing away the coal smoke and sweat of his journey. As he soaked, he tried to make a plan. He had enough money for a few more days, maybe a week if he was careful. That gave him time to look around, ask about work, see if any of the local farms needed a hired hand. It wouldn't be the partnership he'd hoped for, but it would be honest work. By the time he dried off and dressed in his only other set of clothes, slightly less rumpled than what he'd been wearing, the sun was lowering toward the horizon. The worst heat of the day was breaking. Jonas checked his pocket watch. 5:45. Supper at Mrs. Chen's was served family style at a long table in the dining room. There were 4 other boarders, a traveling salesman with slicked back hair and a loud voice, 2 cowboys passing through on their way to a ranch up north, and a school teacher named Miss Thornton who was taking up a position in a settlement 40 miles west. Mrs. Chen served beef stew with vegetables, fresh bread, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. The food was simple but generous, and Jonas ate hungrily. The other boarders chattered away, but he kept mostly quiet, responding politely when spoken to but not volunteering much about himself. "You got business in Cedar Junction?" the salesman asked, mopping up stew with a chunk of bread. "Just passing through," Jonas said. "Not much here unless you're farming. Town's barely 10 years old. Got a mill, a few stores, more churches than saloons, which tells you something about the character of the place." The salesman laughed at his own observation. One of the cowboys leaned forward. "You looking for work? The Triple Bar Ranch is hiring. We're heading there ourselves tomorrow." Jonas considered this. Ranch work might suit him. He was strong enough, certainly. "What's the pay?" "30 a month and found. Hard work, though. Long hours. $30 a month." It wasn't much, but it was something. "What kind of work?" "Everything. Mending fence, breaking horses, moving cattle. Boss is particular about his stock." "I don't know much about horses or cattle," Jonas admitted. The cowboy shrugged. "Ranch hand is ranch hand. You'll learn quick enough if you're willing." "I'm willing." "Then ride out with us tomorrow morning. It's about 6 miles north of town. Can't miss it. Biggest spread in the county." After supper, Jonas stepped out onto Mrs. Chen's front porch. The evening air was cooler now, though still warm. The main street was quieter, most of the shops closed for the night. A few people walked past, heading home after a day's work. Somewhere down the street, a piano was playing badly. Jonas sat in one of the porch chairs. It groaned under his weight, but held, and tried to imagine himself as a ranch hand, rising before dawn to feed horses, riding fence lines under the hot sun, sleeping in a bunkhouse with a dozen other men. It wasn't what he'd hoped for, but it was honest work, and that counted for something. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the woman approaching until she was standing at the bottom of the porch steps. It was her. The woman from the general store. The one who'd been watching him earlier. Up close, Jonas could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s. Her dark dress was old-fashioned and worn, but clean and carefully maintained. In her hands she held something white. A handkerchief, he realized, with delicate embroidery around the edges. She stood there, not speaking, just looking at him with those intense dark eyes. Jonas felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. Was she going to say something about his size? Make some comment about the scene at the train station? Small towns talked and news traveled fast. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. "Can I help you?" She didn't respond. Instead, she climbed the 3 steps to the porch and held out the handkerchief. Jonas stared at it, confused. I don't understand." She pressed it into his hand, her fingers cool and small against his palm. Then she did something completely unexpected. She extended her other hand to him, palm up, in a gesture of offering. "Ma'am?" Jonas stood up, thoroughly bewildered now. "What?" But she just kept her hand extended, waiting. There was something in her expression, a quiet determination, a sadness that matched his own, that made Jonas take her hand without quite knowing why. Her grip was firm despite her small size. She looked up at him. She barely came to his shoulder, and for a long moment they stood there in the fading light, connected by their joined hands, and a confusion Jonas couldn't begin to unravel. Then she tugged gently, indicating he should follow. "Ma'am, I can't just— Where are you? Do you need help with something?" She tugged again, more insistently. Jonas looked back at the boarding house door, wondering if he should call for Mrs. Chen, ask what this was about. But something in the woman's eyes stopped him. This wasn't madness. This was purpose, intent. She wanted him to come with her, and for reasons he couldn't explain even to himself, he decided to trust that. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll come, but just for a moment." She led him down the steps and along the main street. A few people saw them. Jonas was hard to miss, and a strange woman leading a strange man by the hand was noteworthy enough to draw stares, but she seemed unbothered by the attention. She walked with quiet determination, never looking back to see if he was following. They turned down a side street, then another. The buildings grew farther apart, the lots larger. They passed a church with a small cemetery beside it, the white markers glowing in the dusk. Finally, they reached the edge of town where the last houses gave way to open prairie. There, sitting on a small rise surrounded by cottonwood trees, was a farmhouse. It was a simple structure, single story, white paint peeling in places, a stone chimney at one end. Behind it stood a barn that had seen better days, and beyond that, fields stretching into the gathering darkness. The woman led him up the dirt path to the house. The front door was unpainted wood, weathered gray by sun and wind. She opened it and stepped inside, pulling him after her. The interior was dim, lit only by the last of the daylight coming through the windows. Jonas could make out simple furniture, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, a shelf of dishes. Everything was meticulously clean and ordered, but there was a loneliness to the place that hit him immediately. This was a house that had forgotten what it was like to be full. The woman finally released his hand. She went to the table and picked up a slate, the kind school children used, and a piece of chalk. She wrote something quickly, then turned the slate to show him. "My name is Eliza Brandt." Jonas stared at the words. You can't speak." She shook her head, then wrote again. "Not for 2 years. May I ask why? Was there an injury, or—" She erased the slate with her sleeve and wrote more carefully. "Fever took my husband and son. Nothing to say after that." The simple words hit Jonas like a physical blow. He thought of his own loneliness, his own sense of being unmoored from everything familiar. But this woman had lost everything. Her family, her voice, maybe even her will to go on, until something had brought her back. "I'm very sorry," he said softly. "That's a grief no one should have to bear." She nodded, then wrote, "I saw you at the station." "Yes, ma'am." "You were cast aside." Jonas felt his face flush again, but this time with shame rather than embarrassment. "I suppose I was. Yes." "So was I." She underlined the words twice. Then she erased them and wrote, "This farm needs work. I need help. You need purpose. Stay." Jonas read the words 3 times, trying to make sure he understood. "You're offering me work? Room and board in exchange for labor?" She nodded vigorously. "Ma'am, Eliza, that's very kind, but you don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. A drifter, a criminal, She was already writing. "You have kind eyes. You were gentle with your trunk even when tired. You thanked the station master. I trust my instincts." "But please." She wrote the word and looked up at him, and Jonas saw something in her eyes that he recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror. Desperation. The knowledge that this might be the last chance for something better. Jonas looked around the room again. The farmhouse needed work, certainly. He could see places where the walls needed chinking, where the floorboards were warped, where time and neglect had taken their toll. The barn would need even more attention. And the fields, those would require real knowledge he wasn't sure he possessed. But it was a place, a purpose. And it was being offered by someone who understood what it meant to be rejected, cast aside, deemed not good enough. "What about money?" he asked. "I don't have much and I'll need—" She wrote quickly, "Farm makes enough. We share everything. Partners." Partners. The same word Margaret Hutchinson had used in her letters. But this time, it was being offered by someone who'd seen him, really seen him, and decided he was enough. "I don't know anything about farming," Jonas admitted. "I worked in steel mills back in Pennsylvania. I'm strong and I'm not afraid of hard work, but crops and animals, that's not something I know." "I will teach." She wrote it firmly, then added, "My husband was a farmer. I learned from him." Jonas walked to the window and looked out at the darkening prairie. Somewhere out there was the ranch those cowboys had mentioned. $30 a month and a bunk in a crowded building. It was safe, predictable, nothing ventured and nothing gained. But here was something different, a partnership with a woman who couldn't speak but who'd seen something in him worth saving, a farm that needed his hands and his strength, a chance to build something instead of just earning wages. It was crazy. It was impulsive. It was accepting an offer from a woman he'd met an hour ago who'd led him to her house without a single spoken word. It was also the first time since receiving that telegram that Jonas felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely unwanted. He turned back to Eliza. She was standing very still, the slate clutched in her hands, waiting for his answer. In the fading light, she looked small and fragile, but there was steel in her spine. This was a woman who'd survived fever and loss and 2 years of silence, and who was now taking a chance on a stranger because her instincts told her to. "All right," Jonas said quietly. "I'll stay. I'll work your farm, and we'll share everything, and I'll learn what you have to teach me. But I want you to know, I'll respect this arrangement. I'll sleep in the barn, and I won't presume anything beyond the partnership you're offering. Your home is your home, and I won't intrude on that." Eliza's face broke into the first smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her features, taking years off her careworn appearance. She nodded vigorously, then wrote, "Barn has a room, was for hired man before the war. It's yours." She set down the slate and extended her hand again, this time for a handshake. Jonas took it carefully. His hand engulfed hers completely, and they shook on the arrangement. "I'll need to collect my trunk from Mrs. Chen's," he said, "and I should pay her back for the extra night since I won't be staying." Eliza held up one finger, "Wait," and went into what must have been a bedroom. She returned with a small purse and pulled out $2, which she handed to him. "I can pay my own debts," Jonas protested. She shook her head firmly and pressed the money into his hand, then wrote, "Partners share everything, including debts." Jonas found himself smiling for the first time that day. "You're a stubborn woman, Eliza Brandt." She smiled back and shrugged. The walk back to Mrs. Chen's took only 10 minutes. Jonas's mind was racing with questions and concerns, but underneath it all was a feeling he barely recognized: hope. Maybe this wouldn't work out. Maybe he was making another mistake, trusting too quickly, building up dreams that would only be shattered. But maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Mrs. Chen raised her eyebrows when Jonas explained that he wouldn't be needing the second night after all. "You find work so quickly?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am, with a local farm." "Which farm?" "The Brandt place." Mrs. Chen's expression changed, softening with what looked like approval. "Eliza Brandt is good woman, quiet woman. She has hard times since fever. You will be good to her?" "I'll do my best, ma'am." "Then you do fine." She accepted the $2 and waved away his thanks. "You come back if you need anything. My door is open." Jonas collected his trunk and carried it through the now dark streets back to the Brandt farm. A lamp was burning in the farmhouse window, and Eliza was waiting on the porch. She led him to the barn, which was larger inside than it looked from outside, and showed him to the hired man's room. It was small, but adequate. A rope bed with a corn husk mattress, a table, a chair, and a small stove for heat. There were pegs on the wall for hanging clothes and a shelf for personal items. A lantern sat on the table, already lit. "This is fine," Jonas said. "Better than fine." "Thank you, Eliza." She handed him the slate. She'd written, "Breakfast at dawn. I will show you everything." Jonas nodded. "I'll be ready." She hesitated at the door, then wrote one more thing. I am glad you're here." Before he could respond, she was gone, walking quickly across the yard to the house. Jonas watched her go, then closed the door and sat on the bed. It groaned, but held. He unpacked his trunk methodically, hanging his few shirts and pants on the pegs, placing his mother's Bible and his father's pocket watch on the shelf. It didn't take long. He didn't own much. When he was done, the room still looked sparse and temporary. But it was his room, his space, his place. Jonas lay back on the bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the house across the yard, Eliza was probably doing the same thing, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake inviting a strange man to live on her property. Outside, the Kansas night was alive with sounds he wasn't used to: crickets chirping, an owl hooting, the whisper of wind through prairie grass. So different from the grinding machinery and shouted voices of the steel mills. So different from anything he'd known. Jonas closed his eyes and thought about tomorrow. Eliza would teach him about the farm, show him what needed doing. He would learn. He would work. He would prove that her instincts about him were right. And maybe, just maybe, two broken people would find a way to be whole again. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he opened his eyes again, gray light was seeping through the single window and someone was knocking on his door. Jonas sat up quickly, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where he was. "Just a moment," he called. He splashed water on his face from the pitcher Eliza had left, ran his fingers through his hair, and opened the door. Eliza stood there with the slate. "Sunrise. Work begins. Come eat first." The farmhouse kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and frying bacon. Eliza had set 2 places at the table, simple plates and cups, cloth napkins folded neatly. She pointed to one chair and he sat, feeling oddly like he was intruding despite her invitation. She served him bacon, eggs, and toasted bread with butter, then poured coffee that was almost as strong as Mrs. Chen's. She took the other seat and bowed her head briefly before picking up her fork. Jonas quickly did the same, murmuring a brief grace. They ate in silence. What else could they do? But it wasn't uncomfortable. Eliza glanced at him occasionally, checking to see if he needed anything, refilling his coffee cup when it was empty. Jonas ate slowly, trying not to seem too hungry even though he was ravenous. When they finished, Eliza cleared the plates and wrote on her slate, "First, I show you everything, then we make plan." She led him outside into the cool morning air. The sun was just clearing the horizon, painting the prairie gold and pink. The farm looked different in daylight, bigger, with more potential, but also more need. Eliza walked him through it all methodically, her slate always in hand. The barn needed new boards in several places. The chicken coop was functional but should be expanded. The well pump worked but was getting bulky. The fence around the vegetable garden had posts that were rotting. The fields, 40 acres, were planted with wheat, she wrote, but another 40 were lying fallow for lack of time and help to work them. Jonas took mental notes, calculating what he knew how to do versus what he'd need to learn. The carpentry work on the barn and coop that he could handle. He'd built scaffolding in the mills, worked with wood and nails and basic construction. The pump he'd have to figure out, but machines were machines. The fence posts would need to be replaced before winter, but the fields, those were going to be the real challenge. "When does the wheat get harvested?" he asked. Eliza wrote, "October, 3 weeks." "And you've been doing this yourself? The planting, the tending, everything?" She nodded. Jonas looked at the fields stretching away from the barn, 40 acres of wheat rustling in the morning breeze. He couldn't imagine how she'd managed it alone. The physical labor alone would have been exhausting, never mind the knowledge required. "You're stronger than you look," he said. She smiled and wrote, "Had to be. No choice." They spent the morning walking every inch of the property. Eliza showed him where things were kept: tools in the barn, seed in the storage room, animal feed in the bins. She had 2 milk cows, a dozen chickens, and an old horse named Jasper who looked at Jonas with deep suspicion. "Don't worry," Jonas told the horse. "I don't know what I'm doing either." By midday, Jonas had a better sense of what he'd gotten himself into. The work was enormous, more than one man and one woman could reasonably accomplish, even working full days. But it wasn't impossible. With organization, priority, and hard work, they could manage it. They ate lunch on the porch, bread, cheese, and water, and Jonas pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. "May I?" He gestured to her slate. She handed it over and he began writing a list, talking as he went. First priority is getting ready for wheat harvest. That's coming up fast. Second is repairing the barn before winter. We can't have animals cold and exposed. Third is the well pump, because we need water more than anything. Fourth is expanding the chicken coop, because more chickens mean more eggs to sell. Fifth is the fence posts, before the first hard freeze makes the ground impossible to dig. He handed the slate back. Does that seem right to you? Eliza studied his list, then nodded. She added, You learn fast. I worked in steel mills, Jonas said. You learn to prioritize or people get hurt. This isn't so different, just dirt instead of iron. She smiled at that, then wrote, Tonight I teach you about wheat. That evening, after the animal chores were done and supper eaten, Eliza was a plain but competent cook. She brought out a ledger and showed Jonas how her husband had tracked the farm's finances. Income from wheat sales, eggs, milk, expenses for seed, equipment, supplies. It was barely profitable, Jonas could see, but it was sustainable if managed carefully. She also pulled out papers that explained the wheat harvest process, when to cut, how to thresh, where to sell. Jonas read everything twice, knowing he'd need to understand it quickly. You're trusting me with a lot, he said quietly. All this information, your finances, everything. What if I'm not what you think I am? Eliza took the slate and wrote slowly, underlining certain words. Everyone deserves second chance. I am giving you one. You are giving me one. We both start again. Jonas felt something catch in his throat. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The days fell into a pattern quickly. Up at dawn, tend the animals, breakfast together in silence, then work until the sun drove them inside during the hottest part of the afternoon. They'd rest briefly, then return to work in the cooler evening hours. Supper together, evening chores, then Jonas would retire to his room in the barn while Eliza returned to the house. Jonas learned the rhythm of farm work, the patience required, the attention to detail, the way you had to work with the weather and the seasons rather than against them. His mill work had made him strong, but this was different. This required a kind of endurance he hadn't needed before. Eliza taught him everything, using her slate to explain what words couldn't show, demonstrating with her hands when necessary. How to milk a cow without getting kicked, how to check wheat stalks for ripeness, how to know when the chickens were about to start laying. She was patient with his mistakes, and there were many, but firm about doing things the right way. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch in the cooling air, and Jonas would read aloud from the Bible or from an old newspaper Eliza had saved. She'd listen intently, sometimes smiling at passages she recognized. It was companionable, this silence between them. Jonas had been lonely for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist alongside another person without the pressure of constant conversation. One evening, about a week after he'd arrived, Jonas was repairing a fence post when a rider came up the road. He was a well-dressed man on a good horse, not a working ranch horse, but something finer. Jonas straightened up as the man dismounted. "Help you?" Jonas asked. The man looked him up and down with obvious distaste. "I'm looking for Mrs. Brandt. Who are you?" "Jonas Keller. I work here." "Since when does Eliza have money for hired help?" The man tied his horse to the fence rail. "That's between Mrs. Brandt and myself. May I ask your business with her?" The man's face flushed. "My business is my own. Go fetch her." Something about the man's tone made Jonas's jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "I'll see if she's receiving visitors. What name should I give?" "Silas Brandt? I'm family." Jonas found Eliza in the garden, pulling weeds. As soon as he wrote Silas Brandt on her slate, her face went pale and her hand started shaking. "You don't have to see him," Jonas said quickly. "I can send him away." But she shook her head and stood, brushing dirt from her dress. She walked to the front of the house with Jonas following. Her whole posture had changed, shoulders hunched, head down, like she was bracing for a blow. Silas was waiting on the porch, looking around with an air of ownership that made Jonas's hackles rise. When Eliza appeared, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Eliza, it's been too long." He started to reach for her, but she stepped back. His smile faded. "Still not speaking, I see. That's a shame." Eliza lifted her slate. "What do you want?" "Is that any way to greet family? I came to check on you. Make sure you're managing out here all alone." His eyes flicked to Jonas. "Though I see you found company." Jonas felt his fist clench, but Eliza put a hand on his arm. A warning. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," Silas continued. "About money your husband owed me. A debt that needs settling." Eliza's eyes went wide. She wrote furiously, "What debt? Daniel never mentioned—" $500. He borrowed it to buy seed and equipment 3 years back. Said he'd pay me back after harvest, but then the fever came." Silas pulled a paper from his coat pocket. "I have the promissory note right here." Eliza reached for the paper, but Silas held it back. "Not so fast. This is a legal document. It needs to be handled properly." He looked at Jonas. "This doesn't concern you, friend. Why don't you get back to work?" "If it concerns Mrs. Brandt, it concerns me," Jonas said quietly. "We're partners." Silas's eyebrows went up. "Partners? My. You work fast, Eliza. Daniel's barely been dead 2 years and you're already taking up with—" "Watch your mouth," Jonas said, his voice dropping to a tone that had once made steel workers think twice about causing trouble. "Say what you came to say, and then leave." For a moment, the two men stared at each other. Silas was taller than average, but slender, built for commerce rather than labor. Jonas had 7 inches and 100 pounds on him, and they both knew how that fight would end. Silas looked away first. "The debt is legal and binding. $500 plus 2 years' interest. That comes to $650, payable within 60 days. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to take action." He tucked the paper back in his coat. "I'll return in a month to discuss payment arrangements. Do try to have the money ready, Eliza. I'd hate to see you lose this place." He mounted his horse and rode off without another word, leaving Eliza shaking and Jonas furious. "Is it possible?" Jonas asked gently. "Could your husband have borrowed money from him?" Eliza shook her head violently, then wrote with trembling hands, "Daniel and Silas hated each other. Daniel would never borrow from him. Never." "Then the paper is forgery." She underlined it 3 times. "Silas wants my land. He always has." Jonas looked at the road where dust was still settling from Silas's departure. $650 was more money than he'd seen in his entire life. There was no way they could raise that kind of sum, even if the debt was legitimate, which he strongly doubted. "We'll figure this out," he said, though he had no idea how. "We'll find a way." But Eliza was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks, and Jonas felt helpless against her grief. He wanted to put his arm around her shoulders, offer some comfort, but they weren't family or even friends, really, just 2 people thrown together by circumstance and desperation. Instead, he picked up her slate and wrote, "He won't win. I promise you that." Eliza read his words through her tears, then nodded. But as Jonas went back to his work on the fence, he wondered what kind of promise he'd just made, and whether he had any hope of keeping it. The wheat stood ready for harvest under the late September sun, golden stalks bending gently in the breeze like waves on an ocean Jonas had never seen. He stood at the edge of the field with a scythe in his hands, the blade newly sharpened, the wooden handle worn smooth by years of use, and felt the weight of what came next pressing down on his shoulders. 3 weeks had passed since Silas Brandt's visit. 3 weeks of Jonas learning to swing a scythe properly, to bundle wheat into sheaves, to understand the backbreaking rhythm of harvest work. Eliza had shown him everything with patient persistence, demonstrating the movements over and over until his muscles remembered what his mind still struggled to grasp. "Start at the edge," she'd written on her slate that first practice day. "Work your way in. Keep the blade low. Let the weight do the work, not your arms." Jonas had tried, failed, tried again. The scythe had felt awkward and dangerous in his hands, so different from the tools he'd wielded in the mills. But slowly, painfully, he'd learned. His back had screamed in protest those first few days. His hands had blistered despite the calluses he already carried from years of hard labor. But he'd kept at it, driven by the knowledge that this harvest might be all that stood between Eliza and losing everything. Now, on the morning they were to begin in earnest, Jonas took a deep breath and made the first swing. The blade whispered through the stalks, cutting clean and true, and the wheat fell in a satisfying arc. He took another step, swung again, found a rhythm. Behind him, Eliza gathered the fallen stalks and bound them into bundles with practiced efficiency. They worked in silence. What other choice did they have? But it was a comfortable silence now, born of shared purpose and mutual respect. Jonas had learned to read Eliza's subtle signals. When she needed him to slow down so she could keep pace with the bundling, when she wanted him to take a water break, when something wasn't quite right with his technique. By midday, they'd made good progress on the first acre, but Jonas could feel exhaustion settling into his bones. The sun hammered down mercilessly, and sweat soaked through his shirt despite the bandana he'd tied around his forehead. His hands, even with work gloves, were starting to blister in new places. Eliza touched his arm and pointed toward the house. Time to rest through the worst heat. They walked back together, both too tired to do more than drink cool water from the well and eat leftover cornbread from breakfast. Jonas collapsed into the rocking chair on the porch while Eliza sat on the steps. For a long moment, they simply existed in the shade, letting their breathing slow and their muscles recover. Then Eliza pulled out her slate. "You learn fast. Good work today." "I'm not sure fast is the word I'd use," Jonas said with a rueful smile. "Feels like I'm fighting the wheat instead of cutting it." "That will pass. Daniel said harvest is always hard the first time." It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband's name without being prompted, Jonas realized. In the 3 weeks he'd been here, Eliza had kept her grief locked away, revealing it only in the careful way she maintained Daniel's tools, the way she sometimes paused when passing the bedroom they must have shared. "He must have been a good man," Jonas said quietly. "To teach you so much, to build all this." Eliza nodded slowly, then wrote, "He was kind, patient. He wanted children to fill this house with noise." "Your son, how old was he?" 3. She paused, then added, "Thomas." His name was Thomas. Jonas felt his throat tighten. 3 years old, barely more than a baby. "I'm sorry, Eliza. That's a grief that shouldn't exist in this world." She wiped her slate clean but didn't write anything else. Instead, she stood and went into the house, leaving Jonas alone with his thoughts and the distant sound of chickens clucking in their coop. When she returned 10 minutes later, she was carrying something wrapped in cloth. She sat beside Jonas's chair and carefully unfolded the fabric to reveal a small wooden horse, beautifully carved with a flowing mane and lifted front hooves. The craftsmanship was exquisite. "Daniel made this," she wrote, "for Thomas. The boy carried it everywhere." Jonas took the toy carefully, turning it in his large hands. He could see the love in every detail, every carefully smoothed edge designed not to hurt small fingers. He was talented. He was going to teach Thomas to carve. They never had time. She wrapped the horse back up and held it against her chest for a moment before returning it to the house. When she came back out, her eyes were dry, but Jonas could see the effort that composure cost her. They returned to the field in the cooler afternoon air and worked until the sun touched the horizon. By the time they quit for the day, another acre was cut and bundled. At this pace, Jonas calculated, they'd have the entire 40 acres harvested in about 3 weeks, assuming good weather and no disasters. But as they walked back to the barn to tend the animals, Jonas's mind kept returning to Silas Brandt and that supposed debt. $650. It might as well have been $6,000. Even if this harvest was the best Eliza had ever had, it wouldn't come close to covering that amount. After supper, boiled potatoes and salt pork, simple but filling, Jonas sat at the kitchen table while Eliza washed dishes. He pulled out the ledger she'd shown him weeks ago and studied the numbers again, hoping to find something he'd missed. The farm made perhaps $300 in a good year from wheat sales, maybe another $50 from eggs and milk. Against that were expenses for seed, equipment repairs, property taxes, and basic supplies. Eliza had been living on almost nothing, making her clothes last, eating simply, doing without anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. "Eliza," Jonas said carefully, "have you thought about what you'll do if Silas comes back with that promissory note?" She put down the dish she was drying and picked up her slate. "Fight it." "How? Do you have a lawyer?" "No money for lawyers." "Then we need to find another way." Jonas tapped the ledger with his finger. "If the note is a forgery, There might be a way to prove it. Did your husband keep records, letters, anything that might show his financial dealings? Eliza thought for a moment, then nodded. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a wooden box. Inside were papers, receipts, correspondence, the deed to the property. She spread them on the table, and together they went through everything carefully. Daniel Brandt had been methodical about record keeping. There were receipts for seed purchases going back 5 years, letters from buyers in Kansas City discussing wheat quality and prices, even notes about crop rotation and soil management. But there was nothing about any loan from Silas, nothing that even suggested the two men had any financial relationship. What they did find, tucked into an envelope at the bottom of the box, was something else entirely. A letter, dated 4 years earlier in Silas's handwriting. Jonas read it aloud. Dearest Eliza, I hope this letter finds you well. I know your marriage to my cousin has been arranged, but I must speak what is in my heart. I have loved you since we met at the church social, and I believe you felt something for me as well. It is not too late to reconsider. Daniel may own land, but I can offer you a better life in town. Please think on this before the wedding. Yours in hope, Silas. The silence that followed was heavy. Eliza's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. She grabbed the slate and wrote furiously, I never encouraged him. I chose Daniel. Silas could not accept it. So this isn't about money at all, Jonas said slowly. It's about revenge. He wants you to lose the farm so you'll have nowhere else to turn. He thinks I will marry him then. He is wrong. Jonas looked at the letter again, his mind racing. This might help us. It establishes a motive for why he'd forge a debt. If we can show he had reason to want Daniel ruined, it weakens his claim. But how do we prove the note is false? That was the question Jonas couldn't answer. He wasn't a lawyer or a lawman. He was just a mill worker turned farmhand who was in over his head and desperate to help the one person who'd shown him kindness when the world had turned its back. The harvest continued through the following week. Jonas's body adapted to the work, his muscles growing accustomed to the repetitive motion of the scythe. The blisters on his hands hardened into new calluses. He learned to pace himself, to work steadily rather than in exhausting bursts, to read the wheat and know where to cut for maximum efficiency. Eliza worked beside him every day, gathering and bundling with tireless determination. Sometimes Jonas would look up from his cutting to see her working 20 feet behind him, her movements quick and practiced, her face set with concentration. She was stronger than she looked, he'd come to realize. The kind of strength that came not from muscle but from sheer refusal to quit. They fell into deeper patterns of communication too. Jonas learned that when Eliza touched her throat, she was about to write something important. When she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, she was worried. When she smiled, which was happening more often now, tiny lines appeared at the corners of her eyes that made her look younger, despite everything she'd endured. One evening, as they sat on the porch after another long day, Eliza wrote something and hesitated before showing him. You are lonely too. I see it. Jonas looked at the slate for a long moment. He could deflect, change the subject, keep his own grief locked away the way he'd been doing for years. But Eliza had trusted him with her story. Maybe she deserved to hear his. I had a brother, he said quietly. James. 3 years younger than me, we worked the mills together after our parents died. He was quick, clever, always saw the solution to problems before anyone else. Jonas paused, the memory sharp even after all these years. There was an accident. A chain broke on a crane, sent a load of iron beams swinging. James pushed me out of the way. The beams crushed him instead. Eliza's hand found his, squeezing gently. I was 26 years old, Jonas continued. I'd spent my whole life taking care of him, and in the end, he died saving me. The foreman said it was heroic. They gave me a week off work with pay. Then I was expected to go back like nothing had happened, like I hadn't lost the only family I had left. Is that why you left Pennsylvania? Partly. I couldn't stand being in that mill anymore, seeing the spot where it happened every day. But mostly, I left because I was tired of being alone. I thought maybe out west, in a new place, I could find something worth living for again. He gave a bitter laugh. Instead, I got a telegram telling me I was too fat to be useful. Eliza erased her slate and wrote carefully. You are not too fat. You are not useless. You are here and you matter. Jonas felt something break loose in his chest, some tight knot of shame and hurt that had been lodged there since that day at the train station. "Thank you," he managed, "for seeing me when no one else would." She squeezed his hand again, then stood and went into the house. Jonas thought that was the end of the conversation, but she returned a moment later with 2 cups of coffee and a small tin. Inside were sugar cookies, carefully wrapped. "I didn't know you had these," Jonas said in surprise. "Saved for special occasion." She sat beside him and took a cookie. "This is special occasion." They ate the cookies slowly, savoring the sweetness, and watched the sun set over the prairie. For the first time in longer than Jonas could remember, he felt something like contentment, not happiness exactly. There was too much uncertainty ahead for that, but a sense of being in the right place with the right person. The second week of harvest brought rain, not the heavy downpours that could flatten wheat and ruin a crop, but steady drizzle that made cutting impossible. Jonas and Eliza used the time to work on other projects, repairing the barn, expanding the chicken coop, fixing the well pump that had been growing increasingly temperamental. Jonas discovered he enjoyed working with wood. There was a satisfaction in measuring, cutting, and fitting pieces together that reminded him of solving puzzles. He rebuilt an entire section of the barn wall, replacing rotted boards with fresh lumber they'd bought in town. Eliza worked alongside him, holding boards in place while he hammered, handing him tools before he asked for them. On the 3rd day of rain, they made a trip to Cedar Junction for supplies. Jonas hitched old Jasper to the wagon. The horse had finally decided Jonas was acceptable, if not likable, and they drove the 6 miles to town. Cedar Junction was busier than it had been when Jonas arrived. Harvest season brought farmers in from the surrounding area, all needing equipment and supplies. The general store was crowded, and Jonas found himself uncomfortable with the curious stares his size always attracted. But Eliza walked beside him with quiet confidence, her slate tucked under her arm, and somehow that made the stares easier to bear. They weren't staring at Jonas Keller, failed mail-order groom. They were staring at Jonas and Eliza, partners, people with purpose and place. They bought nails, a new axe handle to replace one that had cracked, lamp oil, coffee, flour, and a few other necessities. The storekeeper, a jovial man named Hutchins, greeted Eliza warmly. "Good to see you, Mrs. Brandt. And with help, I see. Your harvest going well?" Eliza wrote on her slate, "Very well. This is Jonas Keller. He is my partner." Hutchins shook Jonas's hand with surprising firmness for such a small man. "Partner, eh? Well, that's fine news. This farm's been too much for one person since Daniel passed. You staying on permanent, Mr. Keller?" "That's the plan," Jonas said. "Good, good. Eliza here is one of our finest people. You treat her right. You hear?" "I intend to, sir." As Hutchins tallied their purchases, Jonas noticed a man watching them from across the store. He was middle-aged, wearing a badge on his vest, the local sheriff, Jonas guessed. The man approached as they were loading their supplies. "Mrs. Brandt," he said, touching his hat brim. "I'm Sheriff Coleman. We haven't officially met, though I've seen you in town." Eliza nodded politely and wrote, "Hello, Sheriff." Coleman's eyes moved to Jonas, assessing. "And you're the new help I've been hearing about. Jonas Keller. I'm Mrs. Brandt's partner in the farm." "Uh-huh." Coleman's tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "You know a man named Silas Brandt?" Jonas felt Eliza stiffen beside him. "I've met him once. Why do you ask?" "He came to see me yesterday. Said he might need to file a claim against Mrs. Brandt here for an unpaid debt. Said there might be trouble if she doesn't pay up." Coleman looked at Eliza. "That true, ma'am? Your husband owe money?" Eliza's hand shook as she wrote, "No debt. Silas is lying." "That's a serious accusation," Coleman said mildly. "You got proof?" "Do you have proof there is a debt?" Eliza wrote back, underlining the words. "Silas says he's got a promissory note, signed and legal. Says he'll bring it to me when it comes time to collect." Coleman shifted his weight. "Look, I don't know what's true here, but if there is a legitimate debt and you can't pay, that's a civil matter. However, if Silas is lying about it, that's fraud, and that's criminal. So I suggest you both get your facts straight before this goes any further." "We will," Jonas said firmly. "And Sheriff, Silas Brandt has been harassing Mrs. Brandt, If he comes around her property again making threats, I'll expect you to do something about it. Coleman's eyebrows went up. That a fact? It is. For a moment, the two men sized each other up. Coleman was probably in his 50s, lean and weathered, with the look of someone who dealt with plenty of trouble in his time. But Jonas had dealt with his share too, and he didn't back down. I'll keep that in mind, Coleman said finally. You folks have a good day now. As they drove the wagon back to the farm, Eliza was quiet even by her standards. Jonas could feel the tension radiating off her. Finally, he pulled Jasper to a stop by the side of the road. Talk to me, he said. Well, write to me. Whatever Silas said to the sheriff, it's got you worried. Eliza's hand shook as she wrote, If sheriff believes Silas, I lose everything. Law will side with a man over a woman who cannot speak. The law is supposed to be blind, Jonas said, though even as he spoke, he knew how naive that sounded. He'd seen enough injustice in his life to know that the law often saw exactly what it wanted to see. I am afraid, Eliza wrote. Silas has money, connections. What do I have? You have the truth, Jonas said, and you have me. I won't let him take this farm from you, Eliza. I swear it. She looked at him with those dark, intense eyes, and Jonas saw the question there. How can you promise that? What power do you have against a man like Silas? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would find a way, or he'd die trying. This woman had given him purpose when he had none, a place when he was unwanted. He owed her more than he could ever repay, and he'd be damned if he'd stand by and watch some bitter, vindictive man destroy her life. They drove home in silence, but as they unloaded the wagon, Eliza touched Jonas's arm and wrote, Thank you for standing with me. Always, Jonas said. That's what partners do. The rain stopped the next day, and they returned to the harvest with renewed urgency. Jonas pushed himself harder, cutting wheat from dawn until dusk, barely stopping to rest. His back ached constantly, and his hands bled through the bandages Eliza wrapped them in each morning, but he didn't slow down. They needed every bushel they could harvest, every dollar they could make. It wouldn't be enough to pay off Silas's fake debt, but maybe it would be enough to hire a lawyer to fight back somehow. Eliza tried to make him slow down, writing concerned messages on her slate about exhaustion and injury, but Jonas waved her off. He'd worked 12-hour shifts in the mill's loading iron in temperatures that would kill a weaker man. He could handle cutting wheat, but on the 15th day of harvest, his body finally betrayed him. He was halfway through a row when his back seized up completely, pain shooting through his spine like lightning. The scythe fell from his hands and Jonas dropped to his knees, gasping. Eliza was beside him in seconds, her hands on his shoulders, her face tight with worry. She helped him slowly to his feet and half walked, half carried him back to the house. For a small woman, she was remarkably strong when she needed to be. She made him lie face down on the kitchen floor, the bed in the barn was too far, and disappeared into the bedroom. When she returned, she had a bottle of liniment and clean rags. Without ceremony, she pulled up his shirt and began working the medicine into his back with firm, knowing hands. The pain was excruciating at first, but slowly it began to ease. Eliza's hands found the knotted muscles and worked them patiently, ignoring Jonas's occasional gasps. She'd done this before, he realized. For her husband, probably, after long days in the field. When she finally stopped, Jonas's back felt like it was on fire, but the seized-up muscles had loosened. He rolled carefully onto his side and looked up at her. Thank you, he said. I'm sorry. I should have listened to you. Eliza held up her slate. You work too hard. You will hurt yourself worse. We need to finish the harvest. We will finish, but not if you break yourself trying. She paused, then added, I need you whole, not heroic. Jonas smiled despite the pain. All right, I'll try to be more careful. Promise. I promise. She helped him to his feet and made him sit at the table while she prepared a poultice for his back. As she worked, Jonas watched her efficient movements, the way her face was set with concentration, and felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't attraction exactly, or maybe it was, but it was more than that too. It was admiration, respect, A growing sense that this partnership they'd formed was becoming something deeper, something neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. They rested for 2 days while Jonas's back healed. Eliza wouldn't let him do anything more strenuous than feed the chickens, and even then she watched him carefully to make sure he wasn't overdoing it. Jonas chafed at the inactivity, but secretly appreciated the forced rest. His body needed it more than he'd wanted to admit. On the second day, as they sat on the porch in the afternoon shade, a dust cloud appeared on the road. Jonas tensed, thinking it might be Silas returning, but as the rider got closer, he saw it was the sheriff. Coleman dismounted slowly, like a man with bad news he didn't want to deliver. "Mrs. Brandt, Mr. Keller." "Sheriff," Jonas said, standing carefully. His back twinged but held. "What brings you out here?" "Official business, I'm afraid." Coleman pulled a paper from his coat. Silas Brandt filed a formal complaint with the county clerk. He's claiming Mrs. Brandt owes him $650 on a promissory note allegedly signed by her late husband. He's demanding payment within 30 days, or he'll petition the court to seize the property in lieu of payment. Eliza grabbed her slate, writing so fast the chalk squeaked. "The note is a forgery." "You got proof of that?" Coleman asked. "Do you have proof it is real?" Silas showed me the note. It's got Daniel Brandt's signature, or what looks like it, dated 3 years ago, witnessed by someone named Jeremiah Hoskins. Coleman looked uncomfortable. "I'm not saying I believe him, ma'am, but the law requires me to deliver this notice. You've got 30 days to either pay the debt or prove it's fraudulent. If you can't do either, a judge will decide." "Who is this Jeremiah Hoskins?" Jonas asked. "Does he live around here?" "Never heard of him," Coleman admitted, which is suspicious in itself. In a county this small, I know most everybody. But a signature on paper is a signature on paper, legally speaking. Jonas felt rage building in his chest. This is a setup. Silas forged that note to steal this farm. You know it, we know it, probably half the county knows it, but he's got money and connections, so the law's going to side with him. "That's not how it works," Coleman said, but his tone suggested he knew Jonas was at least partly right. "Look, I'll do what I can. I'll ask around about this Hoskins fellow, see if anyone knows him. But you two need to get yourselves a lawyer and fight this proper. Don't try to handle it on your own." "We can't afford a lawyer," Jonas said bitterly. "Then you better find a way, because without one you're going to lose." Coleman tipped his hat to Eliza. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I truly am. But I've got to follow the law, even when it stinks." After the sheriff left, Eliza sat on the porch steps and cried silent tears that broke Jonas's heart. He sat beside her, not touching, not speaking, just being present while she grieved for the injustice of it all. Finally, she wiped her eyes and wrote, "I will not marry him. I will burn this farm to the ground first." "It won't come to that," Jonas said, though he had no idea how to prevent it. "We'll find a way. There has to be something we can do." But as the sun set on that bitter day, Jonas couldn't see what that something might be. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of time. Silas had played his hand perfectly, using the law itself as a weapon against a woman who couldn't even speak in her own defense. That night, Jonas lay awake in his room in the barn, staring at the ceiling and trying to think. There had to be an answer, some way to prove the note was forged, or to discredit Silas, or to raise the money somehow. $650. It might as well have been $6,000. He thought about the letter they'd found, the one where Silas had confessed his feelings for Eliza. That established motive, but would it be enough? Could they prove that a man who'd been rejected would forge a debt for revenge? Jonas sat up suddenly, his mind racing. The letter was in Silas's handwriting, and the promissory note allegedly had Daniel's signature. If they could get a sample of Daniel's actual handwriting and compare it to the signature on the note, they might be able to prove it was forged. He pulled on his boots and hurried across the yard to the house. A lamp was still burning in the window. Eliza couldn't sleep either, it seemed. Jonas knocked softly, and she opened the door, her slate already in hand. "I think I know how we can prove the note is fake," Jonas said, excitement making him speak faster than usual. "We need samples of Daniel's handwriting, letters he wrote, documents he signed. If we can show that the signature on Silas's note doesn't match your husband's real signature, it proves forgery." Eliza's eyes widened. She grabbed Jonas's arm and pulled him inside, then rushed to the bedroom. She returned with the box of Daniel's papers, and they spread them across the kitchen table. Letters, receipts, a journal Daniel had kept sporadically, all in his handwriting. Jonas examined each one carefully under the lamplight, trying to memorize the way Daniel formed his letters, the specific quirks of his penmanship. "We need to see the promissory note itself," Jonas said. "Compare it directly." "But Silas won't let us near it." Eliza was writing frantically. "Sheriff said it was filed with county clerk. Public record. We can see it." Jonas felt hope kindle in his chest. "Then tomorrow, we go to the county seat. We examine that note, we compare the handwriting, and we get proof that Silas is a fraud." But Eliza was frowning now, writing more slowly. "County clerk might not let us. Might say we could alter it." She was right. If Silas had thought this through, and Jonas was beginning to realize the man was more cunning than he'd given him credit for, he'd have taken steps to protect the evidence. They'd need a witness, someone official who could verify the comparison without bias. "What about a judge?" Jonas suggested. "Or a lawyer? Someone who could examine both documents and give an official opinion?" "No money for lawyer," Eliza wrote again, frustration evident in the heavy strokes. They sat in silence, the hope that had flared so brightly a moment ago dimming again. Jonas looked at the papers spread across the table, at Daniel's careful handwriting, at the life this man had built and that his widow was fighting desperately to preserve. "There's one other option," Jonas said slowly. "We could confront Silas directly, tell him we know about the forgery, that we have evidence. Maybe he'll back down if he knows we're not going to roll over." Eliza shook her head violently. "Too dangerous. He will know we found letter, might destroy other evidence." "Then what do we do?" Jonas heard the desperation in his own voice. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to take everything from you." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, then wrote something she'd never written before. "I am glad you are here. I could not face this alone." Jonas reached across the table and took her hand, small and work-worn in his large palm. "You're not alone. Whatever happens, we face it together. That's what you told me when I first came here, remember? We both get a second chance." She nodded, squeezing his hand back, and for a moment they just sat there in the lamplight, two damaged people holding on to each other against the darkness pressing in from all sides. Finally, Eliza stood and wrote, "We finish harvest first, then we fight, one battle at a time." It was practical advice, and Jonas knew she was right. The wheat wouldn't wait for their legal troubles to be resolved. They needed every dollar that harvest would bring, needed to see it through before winter made farming impossible. "One battle at a time," Jonas agreed. "Starting tomorrow, we cut wheat like our lives depend on it, because maybe they do." They returned to the harvest at dawn with a renewed sense of urgency, and over the next week Jonas pushed through the lingering pain in his back with grim determination. The scythe became an extension of his arms, the rhythm of cutting as natural as breathing. Eliza worked beside him without complaint, her small frame bending and rising in endless repetition as she gathered and bound the fallen wheat. The weather held, thank God. Clear skies and cool mornings, the kind of autumn days that made Kansas almost bearable. They worked longer hours now, starting before sunrise and continuing until the last light faded from the western horizon. Jonas's hands bled through his gloves, but he wrapped them in fresh bandages each morning and kept going. On the 8th day after Sheriff Coleman's visit, they finished the last row of the 40 acres. Jonas made the final swing of his scythe and stood there breathing hard, sweat dripping from his face despite the cool air. Behind him, Eliza tied off the last bundle and straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back. They looked at each other across the stubbled field, and something passed between them that didn't need words or slate. They'd done it. Against exhaustion and pain and the weight of Silas's threat hanging over everything, they'd brought in the harvest. Jonas walked back to where Eliza stood and extended his hand. She took it, and they shook, formal and solemn, sealing what they'd accomplished together. Then Eliza did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged him, her arms barely reaching around his broad chest, her head pressed against his shoulder. Jonas stood frozen for a moment, uncertain, then carefully put his arms around her. She was so small, so fragile seeming, yet she'd worked as hard as any man he'd known in the mills. He could feel her trembling, whether from exhaustion or emotion he couldn't tell. When she stepped back, there were tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. She pulled out her slate and wrote, "We did it. Thank you." We did it together, Jonas said. I couldn't have managed without you teaching me everything. She shook her head and underlined the words, "You saved this harvest. You saved me." Over the next 3 days, they loaded the bundled wheat onto the wagon in careful loads and hauled it to the mill in Cedar Junction. The miller, a German immigrant named Klaus Zimmermann, examined the grain carefully, running it through his fingers and biting into kernels to test the quality. "Good wheat," he said finally, his accent thick but his English clear. "Very good. You have done well this year, Mrs. Brandt." Eliza wrote on her slate, "How much?" Zimmerman did calculations in a ledger, his pencil scratching across the paper. "For the full harvest, I can give you $275. Jonas felt his heart sink. It was a fair price, probably even generous, but it was nowhere near the $650 Silas was demanding. Still, it was more money than Jonas had seen in one place in years. "We'll take it," Jonas said when Eliza looked to him for confirmation. Zimmerman counted out the money in bills and coins, and Eliza tucked it carefully into the small purse she carried. As they drove the wagon back toward the farm, Jonas tried to calculate their options. 275 from the wheat, maybe another 30 from selling eggs and milk over the next month. That gave them 300, maybe 320 if they were lucky. Not even half of what Silas was demanding. They were halfway home when Jonas pulled Jasper to a stop again. Eliza looked at him questioningly. "We need to talk about what happens if we can't raise the money," Jonas said. "I know you don't want to think about it, but we need a plan." Eliza's jaw tightened, but she pulled out her slate. "I will not give him this farm." "I know, but if the judge sides with Silas, you might not have a choice." Jonas took a deep breath. "Unless we can prove the note is forged before the 30 days are up, that means we need to go to the county seat, examine that document, and find proof it's fake." "When?" "Soon as possible, tomorrow, if we can manage it." Eliza nodded slowly, then wrote, "County seat is 2 days' ride. We would need to stay overnight." Jonas hadn't thought about that. 2 days there, at least 1 day to handle the business, 2 days back. 5 days total, maybe more. And the cost of staying in a boarding house, feeding themselves and the horse, money they could barely afford to spend. But what choice did they have? "Then that's what we'll do," Jonas said. "We'll leave the day after tomorrow. That gives us time to prepare, make sure the animals are cared for while we're gone." That evening, Jonas walked to the neighboring farm to ask if they'd watch over Eliza's livestock while they were away. The Hendersons were an older couple who'd been kind to Eliza since Daniel's death, bringing her food occasionally and checking on her through the worst of her grief. Mrs. Henderson, a round woman with steel gray hair and sharp blue eyes, listened to Jonas's request and nodded immediately. "Of course we'll help. Eliza's been alone too long out here. I'm glad she's got someone now." She looked at Jonas up and down appraisingly. "You treating her right?" "I'm trying to, ma'am." "See that you do. That girl's had more sorrow than anyone deserves. She needs someone steady, someone who won't up and leave when things get hard." "I'm not going anywhere," Jonas said, and realized as he spoke that it was true. Somewhere in the past month, this place had stopped being temporary shelter and started being home. Mrs. Henderson must have heard the sincerity in his voice because she nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now, you be careful in the county seat. That's a rough town. Lots of folks passing through who aren't always honest. Keep your money close and don't trust strangers." The next day was spent in preparation. Eliza baked enough bread to last the journey and packed dried meat, cheese, and apples. Jonas checked the wagon thoroughly, replaced a worn wheel spoke, and made sure Jasper was shod properly for the longer journey. He cleaned and oiled his father's old revolver, which he'd kept wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his trunk since leaving Pennsylvania. He hoped he wouldn't need it, but Mrs. Henderson's warning had reminded him that the world beyond this farm wasn't always safe. That night, as they ate supper together, Eliza wrote something on her slate and hesitated before showing it to him. "I am afraid of what we will find." "Me too," Jonas admitted, "but not knowing is worse. At least if we see the note, we'll know what we're really dealing with." What if it looks real? What if Silas was clever enough to forge it perfectly? It was a fear Jonas had been trying not to think about. Then we find another way. We talk to people who knew your husband, get them to testify about his character. We show that judge the letter where Silas confessed his feelings for you. We make sure everyone understands this isn't about debt, it's about revenge." Eliza looked at him steadily, then wrote, "You have more faith in justice than I do." "Maybe," Jonas said, "but I have faith in the truth. And the truth is that your husband never borrowed money from Silas. That note is a forgery, and we're going to prove it." They left before dawn the next morning, the wagon packed with their supplies, and the precious envelope containing samples of Daniel's handwriting. The road to the county seat was rough, more of a track than a proper road in places, winding through prairie grass that brushed against the wagon wheels. Jonas drove while Eliza sat beside him, occasionally pointing out landmarks or writing notes about which turns to take. The landscape was beautiful in its own stark way, endless rolling hills covered in autumn gold grass, stands of cottonwoods marking where creeks cut through the prairie. They stopped for lunch beside a small stream, letting Jasper drink and rest while they ate bread and cheese in the shade. The day was warm despite the season, and Jonas could feel sweat soaking his shirt. Eliza looked tired too, dust coating her dark dress, but she seemed determined to push through. As they prepared to continue, Jonas noticed a rider approaching from the direction they'd come. He tensed, one hand moving instinctively toward where he'd stowed his revolver under the wagon seat. But as the rider got closer, Jonas recognized him. It was one of the cowboys he'd met that first night at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, the one who'd offered him work at the Triple Bar Ranch. "Well, I'll be," the cowboy said, reining in his horse. "Didn't expect to see you out here, Keller. Thought you were working Mrs. Brandt's farm." "I am," Jonas said carefully. "We're heading to the county seat on business." The cowboy looked at Eliza and touched his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am, name's Tom Holloway. I met your partner here his first day in Cedar Junction." He turned back to Jonas. "You ever change your mind about ranch work? Offer still stands. Boss could use a man your size." "I appreciate that, but I'm settled where I am." "Fair enough." Holloway started to ride on, then paused. "Say, you folks be careful on this road. There's been some trouble lately. Couple of wagons got stopped by men claiming to be toll collectors, took money and supplies at gunpoint." Jonas felt his jaw tighten. "How recently?" "Last one was 3 days ago, about 10 miles shy of the county seat. Sheriff there knows about it, but hasn't caught anyone yet. Just keep your eyes open and don't stop for strangers." After Holloway rode off, Jonas checked the revolver again, making sure it was loaded and ready. Eliza watched him, her face pale, but she didn't write anything. What was there to say? They had to make this journey, dangerous or not. They continued through the afternoon, Jonas scanning the horizon constantly for any sign of trouble. The land grew hillier as they traveled, with more trees and rocky outcroppings where someone could hide. Every time the road curved or passed through a narrow defile, Jonas felt his muscles tense. But the day passed without incident, and by late afternoon they reached a small settlement called Millbrook, about halfway to the county seat. It was barely more than a dozen buildings clustered around a crossroads, but there was a stable and a boarding house. The boarding house was run by a thin, suspicious-looking man who took Jonas's money without comment and showed them to 2 small rooms on the second floor. The accommodations were rough, the mattresses thin and the walls paper-thin, but it was better than sleeping in the wagon. Jonas made sure Eliza's room had a lock on the door before he retired to his own. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the settlement, the distant laughter from what must have been a saloon, the barking of dogs. His mind kept circling back to what they'd find tomorrow at the county clerk's office. What if Silas had been clever enough to forge Daniel's signature perfectly? What if there was no way to prove the note was fake? What then? They'd lose the farm. Eliza would lose everything Daniel had built, everything she'd fought to preserve through 2 years of grief and loneliness, and Jonas would be cast adrift again, unwanted and purposeless. No. He couldn't let himself think that way. They'd come this far. They'd find a way. The next morning dawned gray and threatening rain. They ate a hurried breakfast of fried eggs and hard biscuits, then continued their journey. The road was busier now as they got closer to the county seat, with other wagons and riders heading in both directions. By mid-afternoon, the town appeared on the horizon. It was bigger than Cedar Junction, maybe 3 times the size, with actual streets laid out in a grid and buildings made of brick instead of just wood. The county courthouse stood at the center, a 2-story structure with white columns that looked almost elegant despite the dust coating everything. Jonas drove the wagon to a stable near the courthouse and arranged for Jasper to be cared for. Then he and Eliza walked to the clerk's office, Jonas carrying the envelope with Daniel's papers. The county clerk was a fastidious man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. His nameplate read, Augustus Finch. He looked up from his ledger as they entered, his expression professionally neutral. "Help you?" he asked. "We need to examine a document," Jonas said. "A promissory note filed by Silas Brandt against the estate of Daniel Brandt." Finch's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. "That filing is a matter of public record. However, the original document remains sealed pending the court hearing. I can show you a certified copy." "We need to see the original," Jonas insisted. "We believe it may be fraudulent." "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Keller. Jonas Keller. This is Mrs. Eliza Brandt, Daniel Brandt's widow." Finch looked at Eliza, who pulled out her slate and wrote, "I need to see my husband's alleged signature." "I understand your concern, ma'am, but I can't allow the original to be handled except under court supervision. However, the certified copy is an exact reproduction. If there are irregularities, they'll be visible there." It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. "May we see the copy, then?" Finch disappeared into a back room and returned with a folder. He laid it on the counter and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in neat handwriting. Jonas leaned forward, his heart pounding. The note read, "I, Daniel Brandt, acknowledge receipts of $500 from Silas Brandt on this date, July 15th, 1864. I promise to repay this sum with 5% annual interest within 2 years. Signed, Daniel Brandt. Witnessed by Jeremiah Hoskins." Below the text were 2 signatures. One, presumably Daniel's, was a flowing script with distinctive loops on the capital letters. The other, Jeremiah Hoskins, was more cramped and angular. Jonas pulled out the envelope and carefully extracted several of Daniel's letters. He laid them beside the promissory note and compared the signatures. His heart sank. They looked identical. The same flowing script, the same loops, the same pressure on the pen. If it was a forgery, it was masterfully done. Beside him, Eliza was staring at the documents, her face pale. She pulled out her slate with trembling hands. "That is not Daniel's signature." "Ma'am," Finch said gently, "I understand this is difficult, but the signature appears genuine to me. Several people have examined it already." "No!" Eliza underlined the word 3 times. "Daniel hurt his right hand in 1863. After that, he signed with a slight shake. This signature has no shake." Jonas looked at the signature again, then at the letters they'd brought. She was right. In the more recent letters, particularly one from 1865, there was a barely perceptible tremor in Daniel's handwriting, especially in the capital letters. But the signature on the promissory note was smooth and confident. "Mr. Finch," Jonas said slowly, "do you have records of when exactly this note was filed with your office?" Finch checked his ledger. "It was filed on September 18th of this year by Silas Brandt in person." 3 weeks ago, Jonas said, "but the note is supposedly from July 1864. That's 3 years old. Why would Silas wait 3 years to file it?" "The note stipulates repayment within 2 years, Finch pointed out. "It's not unusual for creditors to give some grace period before taking legal action, especially given that Mr. Daniel Brandt died." "Or," Jonas said, "it's unusual because the note didn't exist until 3 weeks ago. Look at the paper itself, Mr. Finch. Does it look 3 years old to you?" Finch examined the copy more closely, adjusting his spectacles. "I can't judge the age of paper from a copy, Mr. Keller. You'd need an expert for that." "Then we need to see the original," Jonas insisted. "We need someone qualified to examine it, to test the ink and paper, to verify whether this document is really from 1864 or if it's recent." "That would require a court order," Finch said. "You'd need to petition the judge for a forensic examination, and that takes time. The hearing on this matter is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. I'm not sure you'd get the examination completed before then." Jonas felt frustration building. They were so close to proving the forgery, but bureaucracy and procedure were blocking their way. Beside him, Eliza was writing frantically on her slate. "Silas Brandt has connections in this town. He knows people. He knew how to make this look legitimate. We are farmers with no money and no lawyer. The system is designed for us to lose." Finch read her words, and his expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Brandt, I understand your frustration, but I have to follow the law. If you believe this note is fraudulent, you need legal representation. Talk to a lawyer. Get them to file the proper motions. That's how the system works." "The system works for people who can afford lawyers," Jonas said bitterly. "What about people who can't?" "I'm sorry," Finch said, and he sounded like he meant it. "I truly am, but my hands are tied." They left the clerk's office in defeat. Outside, the threatened rain had started, a cold drizzle that matched Jonas's mood perfectly. They stood under the courthouse awning, Eliza staring at nothing while Jonas tried to think. "There has to be a way," he said. "Some lawyer in this town who'd take your case, maybe for a reduced fee or on contingency." Eliza wrote, "We have asked. No one will help without money up front." "Then we make them listen. We find a judge, explain the situation, show them the evidence of Silas's motive. Someone in this town has to care about justice." But even as Jonas spoke, he could hear the desperation in his own voice. They were outmatched, and they both knew it. Silas had money, connections, and a forged document that looked legitimate enough to fool county officials. What did they have? A letter showing rejected feelings and the word of a widow who couldn't speak. They found a cheap boarding house and took rooms for the night. Jonas spent the evening walking the streets of the county seat, stopping at every lawyer's office he could find. Most were closed, but at those that were open he got the same response: no money, no representation. One lawyer actually laughed at him when Jonas explained the situation. "Son," the man said, leaning back in his chair, "even if I believed you, cases like this take months to resolve. I can't work for free that long. Tell your lady friend to find a wealthy relative or marry someone with means. That's her best option." Jonas had to restrain himself from punching the smug expression off the lawyer's face. He left before he did something that would land him in jail. When he returned to the boarding house, he found Eliza sitting in her room with the door open, staring at Daniel's letters spread across the bed. She looked up when Jonas entered, and he saw defeat in her eyes for the first time since he'd met her. "I talked to 5 lawyers, Jonas said heavily. "None of them would help without money." "I'm sorry, Eliza, I don't know what else to do." She picked up her slate slowly and wrote, "We go home. We wait for the hearing. We tell the truth. It is all we can do. The truth might not be enough." "I know." She erased the slate and wrote again, "But it is all we have." That night, Jonas barely slept. He kept thinking about Silas's smug face, about the forged note that looked so perfect, about the system that was designed to protect men with money and connections while grinding down people like Eliza who had nothing but their integrity. There had to be something they were missing, some angle they hadn't considered, some way to prove the forgery that didn't require lawyers and judges and months of legal wrangling. Just before dawn, Jonas sat up suddenly in bed. The witness. Jeremiah Hoskins, the name on the promissory note. If Hoskins was real and had actually witnessed the loan, then maybe the note was legitimate and they were wrong. But if Hoskins didn't exist, or if he existed but denied ever witnessing such a transaction, that would prove the note was forged. The problem was finding him. In a county this size, with people constantly moving in and out, tracking down one man could take weeks or months. Time they didn't have. Unless there was a shortcut. Jonas got dressed quickly and went downstairs to find the boarding house owner, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, who was already up and making breakfast. "Ma'am," Jonas said, "do you know where I could find birth records or census information for this county?" Mrs. Patterson looked at him curiously. "The courthouse keeps those records, but they're not easy to access. Why do you need them?" "I'm trying to find someone. A man named Jeremiah Hoskins. He supposedly witnessed a legal document 3 years ago, but nobody seems to know him." "Hoskins," Mrs. Patterson frowned thoughtfully. "That name sounds familiar. There was a family named Hoskins that lived north of here about 5 years back. The father was named Jeremiah, I think. But they moved away after their barn burned down. Colorado, maybe, or Montana. I remember because the wife was in my sewing circle. Jonas felt excitement building. Do you remember anything else about them? Where exactly they lived or where they might have gone? I'm sorry, no. It was years ago, and I never knew them well. She paused. But Sarah Jennings might remember. She was good friends with Mrs. Hoskins. Lives on Oak Street, third house from the corner. White picket fence. Jonas wanted to go immediately, but it was barely dawn and he couldn't go knocking on strangers' doors this early. He forced himself to wait, eating the breakfast Mrs. Patterson prepared and trying to contain his impatience. When Eliza came downstairs, Jonas quickly explained what he'd learned. Her eyes widened and she wrote, "If Hoskins is real but was not in Kansas in 1864, the signature is forged." Exactly. We need to find out everything we can about this man and where he was 3 years ago. At a more reasonable hour, they walked to Oak Street and found the house with the white picket fence. Sarah Jennings turned out to be a plump, friendly woman in her 60s who invited them in immediately when Jonas explained they were trying to locate the Hoskins family. Oh, the Hoskins! I haven't thought about them in years. Lovely people. Jeremiah was a carpenter, and Martha was the sweetest woman you'd ever meet. They had 3 children, all grown now to Mrs. Jennings poured them coffee without asking if they wanted it. They moved to Montana Territory, I believe, silver mining up there, and Jeremiah thought he could do better building houses for miners than farming in Kansas. Do you remember when they left? Jonas asked. Let me think. It was spring of 1862, I'm certain of that, because my youngest was born that March, and Martha helped with the delivery before they left. Mrs. Jennings smiled at the memory. She wrote me a few times after they moved, but we lost touch eventually. Mail service to Montana isn't reliable. Jonas felt his pulse quicken. So Jeremiah Hoskins left Kansas in 1862 and didn't return? Not that I know of. Martha mentioned once that Jeremiah said he'd never set foot in Kansas again. The drought and locusts had broken his spirit for farming. Mrs. Jennings, Jonas said carefully, would you be willing to testify to that in court? That Jeremiah Hoskins left Kansas in 1862 and to your knowledge never returned? She looked surprised. Testify? What's this about? Eliza pulled out her slate and wrote quickly, explaining the situation with Silas and the forged promissory note supposedly witnessed by Hoskins in 1864. Mrs. Jennings' face darkened as she read. That's fraud, pure and simple. Of course I'll testify. Jeremiah Hoskins was in Montana in 1864, not in Kansas witnessing loans. Anyone who says different is a liar. Jonas felt hope surge through him for the first time in days. Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll need you to come to the hearing and tell the judge exactly what you told us. I'll be there, Mrs. Jennings said firmly. And I'll bring some other folks who knew the Hoskins family too. We'll make sure everyone knows this Silas fellow is trying to cheat a widow. They left Mrs. Jennings's house with renewed determination. It wasn't perfect proof, but it was something. If they could show that the witness on the promissory note was in Montana Territory when the loan supposedly took place, it would cast serious doubt on the document's authenticity. As they walked back toward their boarding house, Jonas noticed a man leaning against a building across the street, watching them. He was rough-looking, with a heavy beard and clothes that had seen better days. When Jonas met his gaze, the man looked away and walked off quickly. Jonas felt unease prickle along his spine. Did you see that man? Eliza nodded and wrote, He has been following us since we left the courthouse yesterday. You're sure? Yes. I saw him twice, different clothes, but same face. Jonas's hand moved instinctively toward where his revolver was hidden under his coat. We need to be careful. If Silas knows we're here asking questions, he might try to stop us from getting back to Cedar Junction with this information. They spent the rest of the day gathering supplies for the return journey and asking more questions about the Hoskins family. By the time evening fell, they had the names of 3 other people who could testify that Jeremiah Hoskins had left Kansas in 1862, but Jonas kept seeing the bearded man, or others like him, watching from doorways and alleys. Eliza saw them too. They were definitely being followed. That night, Jonas knocked on Eliza's door and spoke through it. "Pack everything tonight. We're leaving before dawn tomorrow while it's still dark. I don't like the attention we're drawing." He heard movement inside, then her slate appeared under the door. "Silas hired men to watch us. Probably. Or worse than watch us. We have evidence now that could destroy his case. He might try to make sure it never reaches Cedar Junction." The slate appeared again. "I am afraid." Jonas crouched down so he could speak closer to the door. "I won't let anything happen to you, Eliza, I promise. We just need to be smart about this. We leave early, take a different route back, and we don't stop for anyone." "What if they follow? Then I'll deal with them. But hopefully we can avoid that entirely." They left the boarding house at 4 in the morning, while the town was still dark and quiet. Jonas hitched Jasper to the wagon as quietly as he could, and they slipped out of town heading south instead of west toward Cedar Junction. The plan was to circle around, adding an extra day to their journey, but making it harder to predict their route. Jonas kept his revolver on the seat beside him, loaded and ready. They traveled through the pre-dawn darkness, Jasper picking his way carefully along the rough road. As the sun rose, Jonas kept checking behind them, but saw no sign of pursuit. Maybe they'd been worried over nothing. Maybe Silas's men hadn't been watching the boarding house. But Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe yet. Around midday, as they passed through a narrow valley with steep rocky sides, Jonas saw them. 3 riders blocking the road ahead, armed with rifles and showing no intention of moving aside. "Hold up there," one of them called. He was the bearded man Jonas had seen watching them in town. Jonas pulled Jasper to a stop but kept his hand near his revolver. "This is a public road. We're just travelers heading home." "That's so." The bearded man urged his horse forward a few steps. "Seems like you've been asking a lot of questions in town. Questions about people that don't concern you." "We have every right to ask questions," Jonas said evenly. "Maybe so. But the gentleman who hired us thinks maybe you should forget about those questions. Forget about what you learned. Go home and leave well enough alone." "We're not forgetting anything," Jonas said. "Now move aside." The 3 men exchanged glances. The leader shook his head slowly. "Can't do that. We've got instructions. You turn around, go back to town, and take the train back to wherever you came from. The lady can do what she wants, but you're done helping her. Understand?" "No," Jonas said simply. "We're going home. You can move or you can get hurt. Your choice." The bearded man laughed. "Big talk from one man with a woman to protect. There's 3 of us and we're armed. You think you can—" Jonas didn't let him finish. In one smooth motion, he pulled the revolver and fired a shot that kicked up dirt directly in front of the leader's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider, and the other 2 horses danced nervously. "Next shot goes into flesh," Jonas said calmly. "I don't care if it's horse or man. Now move." For a long moment, nobody moved. The 3 men stared at Jonas, reassessing. He was bigger than any of them, and the steadiness of his hand on the revolver suggested he knew how to use it. Finally, the bearded man backed his horse off the road. "This isn't over. Mr. Brandt paid us good money to make sure you don't interfere." "Mr. Brandt is a fraud and a coward," Jonas said, "and you're working for him, which makes you both. Now get out of our way." The 3 men moved aside, but Jonas could feel their eyes on him as he drove the wagon past them. He kept the revolver visible on his lap, ready to use it again if necessary. Once they were clear of the valley, Jonas urged Jasper into a faster pace. Eliza sat rigid beside him, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the seat. They didn't stop until nightfall, making camp in a grove of cottonwoods well off the road. Jonas built a small fire for warmth and to make coffee, but positioned the wagon where they could see anyone approaching from any direction. As they ate a cold supper of bread and dried meat, Eliza wrote on her slate, "You could have been killed." "So could you," Jonas said. "That's why I wasn't going to back down. Those men needed to know we're not easy prey. What if they follow us? Then I'll do what's necessary to protect us." Jonas checked his revolver, making sure it was fully loaded again. "Eliza, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to let Silas take your farm. I'm not going to let his hired thugs intimidate us. We have evidence now that could prove he's lying, and we're going to get that evidence to Cedar Junction no matter what." She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight, then wrote, "Why do you care so much? This is not your fight." "Yes, it is," Jonas said quietly. You made it my fight when you took me in, when you gave me a second chance, when you trusted me with your home and your grief. This isn't just your farm anymore, Eliza. It's ours. And I'll be damned if I let anyone take it from us. Eliza stared at Jonas across the small fire, the orange light dancing across her face and making the tears in her eyes glisten like stars. She wrote something on her slate, erased it, then wrote again. Finally, she turned it to show him. Ours. Just one word, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. Jonas nodded, feeling something shift and settle in his chest, like a puzzle piece finally finding its proper place. They took turns keeping watch that night. Jonas insisted Eliza sleep in the wagon while he sat with his back against a tree, revolver in his lap, listening to every sound the prairie made in darkness. Coyotes howled in the distance. An owl called from somewhere overhead. The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like whispered secrets. Around midnight, Eliza appeared beside him, wrapped in a blanket. She couldn't sleep either, apparently. She sat down next to him and they shared the watch in silence. Two people bound together by circumstance and determination and something neither of them was quite ready to name. When dawn finally broke, they ate a quick breakfast of leftover bread and coffee, then continued their journey. Jonas chose routes that kept them away from the main roads, following cattle trails and creek beds when he could find them. It added time to the journey but made them harder to track. By late afternoon of the third day, they finally saw Cedar Junction in the distance. Jonas felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. They'd made it. They had evidence that could save the farm, and they'd gotten home safely despite Silas's attempts to stop them. But as they drew closer to town, Jonas noticed something wrong. Smoke was rising from the direction of Eliza's farm, thick and dark against the autumn sky. No, he breathed, urging Jasper faster. The old horse responded as best he could, breaking into a trot that made the wagon bounce and rattle. Eliza had seen the smoke, too. Her face had gone white, and she gripped the wagon seat so hard Jonas thought she might break the wood. They reached the turnoff to the farm, and Jonas drove Jasper at a dangerous pace up the rutted path. As they crested the rise, they could see it clearly now. The barn was engulfed in flames, fire pouring from the windows and licking at the roof. Black smoke billowed into the sky. Jonas pulled the wagon to a halt near the house and jumped down, Eliza right behind him. The heat from the fire was intense even from 50 feet away. Through the roar of the flames, Jonas could hear the panicked sounds of animals inside. "The livestock!" Jonas shouted. He ran toward the barn door, but the heat drove him back. The main entrance was completely blocked by fire. Eliza grabbed his arm, pointing frantically toward the side of the barn. There was a smaller door there, not yet consumed by flames. Jonas ran to it and kicked it open. Smoke poured out, making him cough and his eyes water. He pulled his shirt up over his mouth and nose and plunged inside. The smoke was so thick he could barely see, but he could hear the cows bellowing in terror and Jasper's panicked neighing. The horse was still hitched to the wagon outside, but the two milk cows were in their stalls, and Jonas's small room at the back of the barn held everything he owned. He stumbled through the smoke toward the cow stalls, feeling his way along the wall. His lungs burned and his eyes streamed tears. The heat was increasing by the second as the fire spread. He found the first stall and fumbled with the latch, finally getting it open. The cow bolted past him toward the door. The second cow was harder to reach. Part of the roof had collapsed between Jonas and the stall, and flames were climbing the support posts. Jonas took a running start and jumped through a gap in the burning debris, landing hard on the other side. His pant leg caught fire and he had to stop to beat it out before continuing. He got the second cow free and it ran for the door, wild with fear. Jonas turned to head back the same way, but the gap he jumped through was now completely blocked by fallen, burning timbers. The smoke was so thick now he couldn't see more than a few feet. He dropped to his knees where the air was clear and tried to think. There had to be another way out. A window, maybe, or another door he'd forgotten about. His mind was fuzzy from smoke inhalation and fear, but he forced himself to focus. Then he remembered. There was a loading door in the hayloft used to haul hay bales to the upper level. If he could reach it and get it open, he could jump down to the ground outside. It was a 15-foot drop, but better than burning to death. Jonas crawled toward where he thought the ladder to the loft should be, feeling his way through the smoke. His hands found wood and he pulled himself up, climbing blindly. The heat was worse up here, the smoke even thicker. He could feel the barn shuddering as more of the structure gave way. His groping hands found the loading door's latch. He yanked it open and fresh air rushed in, momentarily clearing the smoke. Jonas could see the ground far below, and standing there looking up at him was Eliza. Her face was a mask of terror. Jonas didn't hesitate. He launched himself through the opening, praying he wouldn't break his leg or his neck. For a moment he was falling through space. Then he hit the ground hard and rolled. Pain shot through his shoulder and his left ankle twisted, but he was alive. Eliza was there instantly, helping him up, checking him frantically for injuries. Her hands moved over him, patting out small embers that had caught on his clothes, touching his face as if to convince herself he was real. Jonas leaned on her. She was stronger than she looked, and they limped away from the barn as the roof collapsed inward with a roar and a shower of sparks. The 2 milk cows were standing near the house, shaking but unharmed. Old Jasper, still hitched to the wagon where Jonas had left him, tossed his head nervously. Jonas and Eliza stood watching the barn burn, too exhausted and shocked to do anything else. There was no point trying to fight the fire now. It had taken hold too completely. All they could do was make sure it didn't spread to the house. That's when Jonas saw the figure on horseback at the edge of the property, silhouetted against the setting sun. Even from a distance, he recognized Silas Brandt's posture, the way he sat his horse. Silas raised one hand in a mocking salute, then turned and rode away. Jonas felt rage surge through him, hot and pure. Silas had done this. Either directly or through his hired men, he'd burned the barn in retaliation for Jonas and Eliza's trip to the county seat. This wasn't just about the fake dead anymore. This was attempted murder. Eliza tugged at Jonas's arm and showed him her slate. The Hendersons, they were watching the animals. Are they safe? Jonas felt his blood run cold. He'd forgotten about the neighbors who'd agreed to check on the livestock while they were gone. If they'd been here when the fire started, if Silas or his men had hurt them. We need to check on them, Jonas said. Can you handle things here? Make sure the fire doesn't spread? Eliza nodded, already moving toward the well to start filling buckets with water. Jonas unhitched Jasper from the wagon, wincing at the pain in his ankle, and rode bareback to the Henderson farm. He found them safe, thank God. Mr. Henderson was in his barn doing evening chores, and Mrs. Henderson was in the house preparing supper. But when Jonas told them about the fire, their faces went pale. We were there just 2 hours ago, Mrs. Henderson said, her hand pressed to her chest. Fed the animals and checked the water like we promised. Everything was fine. How could it have started so fast? It didn't start by accident, Jonas said grimly. Someone said it deliberately. Mr. Henderson's jaw tightened. Silas Brandt. I saw him watching as it burned. He didn't try to hide it. That settles it, Henderson said, already moving toward his horse. We're getting the sheriff. This has gone too far. Within an hour, half of Cedar Junction seemed to have gathered at Eliza's farm. The Hendersons had spread the word, and neighbors came with buckets and shovels to help contain the fire and make sure it didn't spread to the prairie grass. By the time Sheriff Coleman arrived with 3 deputies, the barn had collapsed completely into smoldering ruins, but the house and outbuildings were safe. Coleman surveyed the damage with a grim expression, then approached Jonas and Eliza. Tell me what happened. Jonas explained everything, their trip to the county seat, what they'd learned about Jeremiah Hoskins, the men who'd tried to stop them on the road, and finally seen Silas watching the barn burn. You're saying Silas Brandt did this, Coleman said flatly. I'm saying he was here watching it burn, and he'd already tried to have us stopped from returning with evidence against him. You connect the dots, Sheriff. Coleman looked at the ruins of the barn, then at Eliza's soot-stained face, then back at Jonas. I'll need statements from both of you, and from anyone who saw Silas here today. You'll need more than that, Jonas said. You'll need to arrest him before he tries something worse. On what charge? Being present at a fire isn't a crime. And those men who stopped you on the road, did you get their names? Can you identify them? Jonas felt his frustration mounting. So he gets away with it? He burns down our barn, tries to intimidate us with armed men, and there's nothing you can do? I didn't say that, Coleman replied. I said I need evidence, real evidence, not just suspicions and coincidences. Now, I believe you that something crooked is going on here, but I need to build a case that will stand up in court, or a judge will throw it out before it even starts. One of the neighbors, an old farmer named Gustav Larsen, stepped forward. I saw someone riding away from this direction about an hour before the smoke started. Couldn't see who it was from my place, but it was a single rider heading toward town. That's something, Coleman said. Anyone else see anything? A few more neighbors spoke up with similar observations. No one had seen the fire actually being set, but several had noticed unusual activity near Eliza's farm that afternoon. It was circumstantial, but it was building into a pattern. Coleman pulled out a notebook and started taking statements. While he did that, Jonas limped to where Eliza was sitting on the porch steps, staring at the smoking ruins. He sat beside her, his ankle throbbing, his shoulder aching, his lungs still raw from smoke. She turned her slate to him. Everything you owned was in that barn. Jonas thought about his few possessions, his mother's Bible, his father's pocket watch, the extra clothes, the small amount of money he'd saved. All of it gone now, turned to ash and smoke. Things can be replaced, he said quietly. Lives can't. I'm just grateful you weren't in there when it started, that Hendersons weren't trapped inside. Silas is trying to break me, to make me give up. Is it working? Eliza looked at him for a long moment, then wrote, No. Now I am just angry. Jonas felt a smile tug at his mouth despite everything. Good. Anger is useful. Anger gets things done. They sat together as darkness fell, and the neighbors gradually dispersed, promising to return tomorrow to help clean up and salvage what they could. Sheriff Coleman finished taking statements and approached them one last time. I'm going to talk to Silas Brandt tonight, he said. Ask him where he was this afternoon, what he knows about this fire. I can't arrest him without evidence, but I can let him know he's being watched. Might make him think twice about trying anything else. Or it might make him more desperate, Jonas said. That's possible too, which is why I'm leaving one of my deputies here tonight, just in case. Coleman gestured toward a young man with a rifle. Tom will sleep in your house. Keep an eye on things. If anything happens, he'll be here to help. After the sheriff left, Jonas and Eliza surveyed what was left of their farm. The house was intact, thank God. The chicken coop and the small shed where they kept tools were also undamaged. The 2 milk cows had been moved to the Hendersons' farm for the night, but the barn, which had housed animals and equipment and Jonas's living space, was nothing but smoking rubble. The deputy, Tom Reeves, seemed barely out of his teens but carried himself with quiet competence. He checked the doors and windows of the house, then stationed himself on the porch with his rifle across his knees. Inside, Eliza heated water for washing and brought out clean clothes for Jonas. His current outfit was ruined, covered in soot and torn from his escape through the burning barn. He washed in the kitchen, scrubbing the smoke smell from his skin as best he could, then changed into a shirt and pants that had belonged to Daniel. They fit reasonably well. Daniel had been a big man too, though not quite as large as Jonas. Wearing a dead man's clothes felt strange, but Jonas was grateful for them. He had nothing else now. Eliza made a simple supper of soup and bread, but neither of them had much appetite. They sat at the kitchen table picking at their food while the deputy kept watch outside. Finally, Eliza wrote on her slate, Where will you sleep? The barn is gone. Jonas hadn't thought about that. His room, his bed, his space, all of it was gone. I can sleep in the shed, I suppose, or make a bedroll on the porch. Eliza shook her head and wrote, Too dangerous. Silas might send men tonight. You need to stay in the house. Eliza, I can't. It wouldn't be proper. People would talk. Let them talk. I need you alive, more than I need a good reputation. She had a point, Jonas had to admit. If Silas was desperate enough to burn the barn, he might be desperate enough to try something worse. And Jonas couldn't protect Eliza from the shed or the porch. All right, he said, but I'll sleep on the floor in the main room. You keep your bedroom and your privacy. Eliza nodded and went to get blankets and a pillow. She made up a pallet on the floor near the fireplace while Jonas watched, feeling awkward and grateful in equal measure. When she was done, she wrote, Thank you for saving the animals, for risking your life. That's what partners do, Jonas said, echoing the words he'd spoken to her weeks ago. She smiled at that, then surprised him by reaching out and taking his hand. Her fingers were small and cool in his large, work-roughened palm. She squeezed once, then released him and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Jonas lay down on the pallet and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the deputy shifting position on the porch, the distant yip of coyotes. His body ached in a dozen places, and his mind wouldn't stop racing. What would Silas do next? How far would he go to get what he wanted? And how could Jonas and Eliza possibly stand against a man who was willing to burn buildings and hire armed thugs? Sleep finally came sometime after midnight, but it was restless and filled with dreams of fire. Jonas woke to the sound of horses and voices outside. He sat up quickly, reaching instinctively for his revolver before remembering it had been lost in the barn fire. But the voices didn't sound threatening, and through the window he could see it was already mid-morning. He'd slept later than he'd intended. He pulled on his borrowed clothes and stepped outside to find a dozen wagons and at least 30 people gathered in the yard. The Hendersons were there, along with Mrs. Chen from the boarding house, Klaus Zimmerman from the mill, and what seemed like half the town of Cedar Junction. Gustav Larsen stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "We heard about the fire. Came to help rebuild." Jonas felt emotion catch in his throat. "We can't pay." "Nobody asked you to," Larsen said gruffly. "Eliza's one of ours. You help her. That makes you one of ours too. Now, we brought lumber and tools and enough hands to frame up a new barn in 2 days if we work hard. You going to stand there arguing, or you going to help?" Eliza appeared beside Jonas, her slate already in hand. "Thank you all. I do not know what to say." "Don't need to say anything," Mrs. Chen said, stepping forward with a basket. "Just accept help when it's offered. Now, I brought food for everyone. Let's feed these workers before they start." The next 2 days were a blur of activity. The men cleared away the burned rubble, salvaging what could be saved, some tools, a few pieces of hardware, and hauling away the rest. Then they began construction on a new barn, smaller than the original but sturdy and well-built. The women brought food, gallons of it, and set up tables in the yard where everyone could eat together. Children ran around playing while their parents worked. It felt less like a work crew and more like a community celebration, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Jonas worked alongside the others, hammering nails and lifting beams despite the pain in his shoulder and ankle. People kept introducing themselves, sharing stories about Eliza and Daniel, about their own struggles with weather and crop failures and the general hardness of frontier life. Jonas learned that Daniel had helped many of these people when they were struggling, lending tools or labor, or sometimes just a sympathetic ear. Now they were repaying that kindness to his widow. On the second day, as Jonas was helping raise a wall frame, Sheriff Coleman arrived. He dismounted and approached Jonas with an expression that suggested bad news. "I talked to Silas Brandt," Coleman said. "He claims he was in town all afternoon the day of the fire. Says he has witnesses who saw him at the bank and the general store." "He's lying," Jonas said flatly. "Maybe so, but I can't prove it. His witnesses are respectable business owners. I can't just call them liars without evidence." Coleman lowered his voice. "However, I did learn something interesting. Silas has been borrowing money, a lot of it. Apparently his business ventures aren't going as well as people think. He's leveraged to the hilt and desperate for cash." Jonas felt pieces clicking together in his mind. So he needs Eliza's farm. Not just because he wants her, but because he needs the land to sell or use as collateral. "That's my thinking," Coleman said, "which makes him even more dangerous. A man who wants something is predictable. A desperate man who needs something will do anything to get it. So what do we do? You be careful. You watch your backs. And you hope that when the hearing comes, the judge sees through Silas's lies." Coleman paused. "The hearing is set for a week from today. County judge will be in Cedar Junction to hear the case. I suggest you prepare your evidence and hope it's enough." After Coleman left, Jonas found Eliza and told her about the hearing date. They had 1 week to prepare their case, to organize their evidence, to convince a judge that Silas was lying. 1 week to save everything. That night, after the volunteers had gone home and the new barn stood complete except for some finish work, Jonas and Eliza sat on the porch and looked at what their community had built. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and real, a testament to the fact that they weren't as alone as they'd felt. Eliza wrote on her slate, "I never knew so many people cared." You helped them when they needed it, through your husband, if not directly. Now they're returning the favor. Jonas stretched his sore muscles. We're going to win this, Eliza. We have evidence that Jeremiah Hoskins wasn't even in Kansas when that note was supposedly signed. We have testimony about Silas's motives. We have the truth on our side. The truth does not always win, Eliza wrote. Maybe not, but we're going to fight like it does. The week passed in a blur of preparation. Jonas and Eliza organized all their documents, wrote out timelines, prepared questions they wanted to ask. Mrs. Sarah Jennings arrived from the county seat with 2 other witnesses who'd known the Hoskins family. She'd made the 2-day journey just to help them, refusing any payment. Martha Hoskins was my friend, she said simply. I won't let someone use her husband's name for fraud. The day before the hearing, Silas Brandt appeared at the farm. He rode up alone in the afternoon, dismounting slowly and approaching the house with his hands visible and empty. The deputy who'd been stationed there for the past week immediately stepped between Silas and the porch. That's close enough, Tom Reeves said, his hand on his holstered revolver. I'm not here for trouble, Silas said smoothly. I just want to talk to Eliza, privately. Jonas stepped out of the house, Eliza right behind him. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of witnesses. Silas's eyes flicked to Jonas, and for a moment, pure hatred flashed across his face before he masked it with false friendliness. Mr. Keller, I heard you were quite the hero during the unfortunate fire. Saved the livestock, I understand. Impressive. What do you want, Silas? Jonas asked, his voice flat. I want to make a reasonable offer. A way to resolve this whole unfortunate situation without the unpleasantness of a court hearing. Silas looked past Jonas to Eliza. I'm willing to forgive half the debt, $325 instead of $650. You could raise that much, surely. Sell some land, take a loan. It would be so much simpler than fighting this in court. Eliza stepped forward and held up her slate. The debt is fake. You forged that note. Now, Eliza, that's a very serious accusation, especially since you have no proof. Silas's voice took on a harder edge. The note is legal and binding. The signature is authentic. I have a witness. You have nothing but conspiracy theories and wishful thinking. We have Jeremiah Hoskins' friends and neighbors, Jonas said. People who will testify he was in Montana when your note was supposedly signed. People who will tell the judge you're lying. For the first time, Silas looked uncertain. Montana? What are you talking about? We did our research, Silas. We know Hoskins left Kansas in 1862. He couldn't have witnessed anything in 1864 because he wasn't here. Your whole case is built on a lie, and tomorrow everyone's going to know it. Silas's mask slipped completely. His face flushed red and his hands clenched into fists. You think you're so clever. You think you can waltz into this county, into her life, and play the hero. But you're nothing, Keller. A fat nobody who was rejected by the woman who was supposed to marry him. Eliza only took you in out of pity. Jonas felt the words hit home, reopening wounds he'd thought had healed. But before he could respond, Eliza was there, stepping between him and Silas, her slate held high. Jonas is worth 10 of you. He is kind, honest, and brave. You are a coward and a fraud. Silas's face twisted with rage. You'll regret this, both of you. When the judge rules in my favor tomorrow, when you lose this farm, you'll wish you'd taken my generous offer. And you, Eliza, when you have nowhere else to go, don't come crawling to me. I wouldn't have you now if you were the last woman in Kansas. Good, Jonas said quietly, because she'd never marry a man who sets fires and hires thugs. Now get off this property before I throw you off. Silas took a step back, his eyes darting between Jonas's face and the deputy's hand on his gun. You haven't won yet. Tomorrow we'll see who the law sides with. And Keller, watch your back. Accidents happen all the time out here on the prairie. He mounted his horse and rode away, but Jonas could feel the threat hanging in the air like smoke. Silas was desperate now, backed into a corner. Tomorrow's hearing would determine everything, and Jonas had no idea which way it would go. That night, Jonas couldn't sleep. He lay on his pallet staring at the ceiling while his mind ran through every possible outcome. What if the judge didn't believe their witnesses? What if Silas had bribed someone? What if the law really did favor men with money over widows who couldn't even speak in their own defense? Around midnight, he heard Eliza's bedroom door open. She appeared in her nightgown, carrying her slate. She sat down beside him and wrote, "Cannot sleep either. I keep thinking about what Silas said, about how I'm nothing, about how you only took me in out of pity." Eliza erased her slate and wrote carefully, "You think that is true? Isn't it? I was rejected, desperate, broke. You felt sorry for me. At first maybe, but not now." She erased and continued, "You have given me purpose, hope, someone to share the burden. You risked your life for this farm, for me. That is not nothing." Jonas felt emotion rising in his chest. "You gave me the same things, Eliza, a place to belong, work that matters, someone who sees me as more than just my size or my failures." She set down the slate and did something she'd never done before. She reached out and touched his face, her small hand gentle against his cheek. In the dim moonlight coming through the window, Jonas could see tears in her eyes. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "when we go into that hearing, we go together. Partners to the end, no matter what happens. Agreed?" Eliza nodded, then picked up her slate one more time. "Partners. Always." She returned to her bedroom, leaving Jonas with a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. And somehow, that made even the impossible seem bearable. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray, with clouds pressing low over the prairie like a weight. Jonas woke before sunrise, his stomach tight with anxiety, and found Eliza already awake in the kitchen, dressed in her best black dress, the same one she'd worn the day she first approached him at the train station. She'd made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and they drank it in silence while the deputy checked his rifle one more time. Tom Reeves would escort them to town, Sheriff Coleman's orders. Nobody was taking chances with Silas anymore. By the time they hitched Jasper to the wagon and loaded their box of evidence, half a dozen neighbors had arrived to accompany them. The Hendersons came in their wagon, Mrs. Chen rode alongside on a sturdy mare, and Gustav Larson brought 3 other farmers who'd known Daniel. They formed a small procession heading into Cedar Junction, a show of solidarity that made Jonas's throat tight with gratitude. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock in the town hall, the largest building in Cedar Junction. By 9:30, the place was already packed. It seemed like everyone in the county had turned out to see how this would unfold. Jonas helped Eliza through the crowd, people reaching out to touch her arm or nod encouragement as they passed. Silas was already there, sitting at a table near the front with a well-dressed man Jonas didn't recognize. The man had the sharp, calculating look of a lawyer, and he was shuffling through papers with practiced efficiency. Silas looked confident, almost smug, barely glancing at Jonas and Eliza as they took their seats on the opposite side of the room. Sheriff Coleman stood near the door, arms crossed, watching everything with his sharp lawman's eyes. When the clock struck 10, a side door opened and Judge Henry Morrison entered. Morrison was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and a face that had seen every kind of human foolishness. He wore black robes and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd been making difficult decisions for decades. He took his seat at the raised desk at the front of the room and surveyed the crowd with mild surprise. "Well," he said dryly, "I see this case has attracted some interest. Let's get started. Bailiff, call the case." A thin man with a ledger stood and read in a monotone voice. "Brandt versus Brandt. Case regarding collection of debt allegedly owed by the late Daniel Brandt to Silas Brandt, now claimed against the estate and widow, Mrs. Eliza Brandt." Judge Morrison looked at both tables. "Who's representing the plaintiff?" The well-dressed man stood smoothly. "Arthur Pemberton, Your Honor, attorney for Mr. Silas Brandt." "And the defendant?" Jonas stood, feeling suddenly very aware of every eye in the room. "Mrs. Eliza Brandt will represent herself, Your Honor. I'm Jonas Keller, acting as her assistant since Mrs. Brandt is unable to speak." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Unable to speak? Is this a permanent condition?" Eliza stood and held up her slate, which Jonas had helped her prepare. "I lost my voice to grief 2 years ago. I can write, but not speak." The judge read it, his expression softening slightly. "I see. That will make this proceeding more difficult, but we'll manage. Mr. Keller, you may read Mrs. Brandt's written responses aloud for the record. Now, Mr. Pemberton, present your case. Pemberton stood and launched into his argument with the Polish of someone who'd done this 100 times before. He described the alleged loan of $500 made by Silas to Daniel in 1864, the promise to repay with interest, Daniel's death before repayment could be made, and the debt that now fell to his widow. He produced the promissory note with a flourish, handing it to the judge. As you can see, Your Honor, the note is properly executed, signed by the debtor, and witnessed by a third party. It represents a legitimate debt that remains unpaid. My client has been more than patient, waiting over a year after the debt came due before taking legal action. Now he simply asks for what is owed to him, plus reasonable interest as specified in the note. Morrison examined the note carefully, then looked at Jonas and Eliza. What's your response to this claim? Jonas stood again, his heart pounding. Your Honor, we believe this note is a forgery. Daniel Brandt never borrowed money from Silas Brandt. In fact, the two men had a contentious relationship. We have evidence that Silas has ulterior motives for making this claim. That's a serious allegation, Morrison said. What evidence do you have? Jonas opened the box they'd brought and carefully pulled out the letter Silas had written to Eliza before her marriage. This letter, written by Silas Brandt 4 years ago, establishes that he had romantic feelings for Mrs. Brandt. She rejected him and married Daniel instead. We believe this claim is revenge for that rejection, not a legitimate debt. Pemberton was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. My client's personal feelings from years ago have no bearing on the validity of a legal document. This is a transparent attempt to smear Mr. Brandt's character rather than address the actual debt. The motive is relevant, Jonas countered. It shows why he'd forge a note. Morrison held up a hand. I'll allow the letter into evidence, but Mr. Pemberton has a point. Motive suggests possibility, not proof. Do you have evidence that the note itself is fraudulent? This was the critical moment. Jonas pulled out the samples of Daniel's handwriting and laid them on the judge's desk alongside the promissory note. Your Honor, if you compare Daniel Brandt's genuine signatures to the one on this note, you'll see discrepancies. Daniel injured his hand in 1863, and after that, his signature always showed a slight tremor. The signature on this note is smooth and confident, suggesting it was forged before Silas knew about the injury. Morrison picked up a magnifying glass and examined the signatures carefully. The room was so quiet Jonas could hear his own heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, the judge looked up. I see what you're describing. There is a tremor in these authenticated signatures that's absent in the note. However, injuries don't always affect penmanship consistently. I'd need an expert's opinion to determine if this constitutes proof of forgery. He looked at Pemberton. Does your client have an explanation for this discrepancy? Pemberton conferred briefly with Silas, then stood. Your Honor, my client suggests that Mr. Brandt's hand may have been particularly steady on the day he signed the note, or perhaps the tremor developed later than alleged. Without medical records documenting the exact date and nature of the injury, this is merely speculation. Jonas felt frustration rising. They were so close, but the lawyer was finding ways to explain away every piece of evidence. He looked at Eliza, who was gripping her slate so hard her knuckles were white. Then Morrison spoke again. What about the witness listed on the note? This Jeremiah Hoskins. Can he be called to testify? Unfortunately, no, Your Honor, Pemberton said. Mr. Hoskins has since passed away, according to my client, but his signature appears genuine, and there is no reason to doubt he witnessed the transaction as indicated. Jonas stood quickly. That's not true, Your Honor. Jeremiah Hoskins isn't dead. He's alive in Montana Territory. And more importantly, he left Kansas in 1862, 2 years before this note was supposedly signed. He couldn't have witnessed anything because he wasn't even in the state. A murmur ran through the crowd. Silas's face went pale, then flushed red. Pemberton looked genuinely surprised, turning to his client with a questioning expression. Do you have proof of this? Morrison asked sharply. We have witnesses, Your Honor, people who knew the Hoskins family and can testify to when they left Kansas. Morrison sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Call your first witness. Mrs. Sarah Jennings made her way to the front of the room, moving with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. She took her seat and placed her hand on the Bible the bailiff offered, swearing to tell the truth. Jonas began the questioning, trying to remember everything he'd seen in courtrooms back in Pennsylvania. Mrs. Jennings, how did you know Jeremiah Hoskins? He and his wife Martha were our neighbors for 6 years, Sarah said clearly. Good people. Jeremiah was a carpenter, built half the barns in the county before the drought got too bad. When did the Hoskins family leave Kansas? Spring of 1862. I remember exactly because Martha helped me with my youngest child's birth in March, and they left in April. Jeremiah had decided farming wasn't working out, and they'd heard about opportunities in Montana Territory. Did Jeremiah Hoskins ever return to Kansas? No, sir. Martha wrote me a few times after they left, and she mentioned that Jeremiah said he'd never set foot in Kansas again. The drought and locusts had broken his spirit for farming. So, to your knowledge, Jeremiah Hoskins was not in Kansas in July of 1864. He most certainly was not. He was in Montana, building houses for miners. Pemberton stood to cross-examine. Mrs. Jennings, you said Martha wrote you a few times. Do you still have those letters? Sarah's face fell slightly. No, sir. I'm sorry to say I don't. I kept them for a while, but they were destroyed in a fire that damaged our barn several years back. So you have no physical evidence of this correspondence? No, but I remember. You remember, Pemberton said smoothly, but memories can be faulty, especially about events from years ago. Isn't it possible you're confused about the dates? That perhaps the Hoskins family left in 1865 or 1866 after the note was signed? No, it was definitely 1862. My baby was born in March of that year, and Martha was there. They left the next month. Do you have birth records for this child? Well, no. The doctor who attended the birth has since moved away, and I never filed official papers. It was just a home birth, like most out here. Pemberton nodded sympathetically. So again, we have only your memory to support this timeline. No documents, no corroborating records. Your Honor, while I respect Mrs. Jennings' sincerity, her testimony is not sufficient to prove fraud. Memory alone cannot override a signed legal document. Jonas called 2 more witnesses who'd known the Hoskins family, and they told the same story. But Pemberton picked apart each testimony, pointing out the lack of physical evidence, the reliance on memory, the absence of any official records proving when the Hoskins family had left Kansas. By the time the witnesses were finished, Jonas could see doubt creeping into Judge Morrison's expression. The testimonies were consistent, but they were also circumstantial, and Silas had a lawyer who knew exactly how to cast doubt on circumstantial evidence. Morrison called a brief recess, and Jonas stepped outside with Eliza. She was shaking, her face pale, and she wrote on her slate with trembling hands, "We are going to lose." Not yet, Jonas said, though his own confidence was wavering. The judge seemed interested in the handwriting issue, and the witness testimony was strong, even if Pemberton tried to discredit it. It is not enough. Silas has a lawyer. We have memories and suspicions. Jonas looked around at the crowd gathered outside the town hall. Their neighbors, their friends, all the people who'd come to support them. Mrs. Chen caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. Gustav Larson raised a fist in solidarity. These people believed in them, believed in the truth. But would that be enough? When they returned inside, Morrison was back at his desk, reading through papers. He looked up as everyone took their seats. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented," he said. "The promissory note appears legitimate on its face. The signature, while showing some variation from other samples, is not so different as to conclusively prove forgery. The testimony about Mr. Hoskins is compelling, but without documentary evidence, I cannot disregard a signed legal document on the basis of memory alone." Jonas felt his heart sink. Beside him, Eliza had gone completely still. "However," Morrison continued, "I am troubled by several aspects of this case. The timing of when the note was filed, 3 years after it was allegedly signed. The convenient death of the witness, according to the plaintiff, when in fact he appears to be alive in another territory. The demonstrated motive for fraud. And most significantly, the variation in the signature that suggests possible forgery." He paused. letting his words sink in. Therefore, I am ordering an independent expert examination of the promissory note. The document will be sent to a handwriting expert in Kansas City who will analyze the ink, paper, and signature authenticity. This examination will take approximately 3 weeks. Until that analysis is complete, this case is continued, and no collection action may be taken against Mrs. Brandt or her property. Relief washed through Jonas so powerfully he felt dizzy. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a reprieve. 3 more weeks to find more evidence, to prepare, to fight. Pemberton was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, my client has already waited years for payment. To delay further, your client will wait 3 more weeks, Morrison said firmly. If the note is genuine, the delay won't matter. If it's fraudulent, then justice requires we discover that before allowing collection. My ruling stands. Silas stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. That note is legal and binding. I have every right. Mr. Brandt, Morrison's voice cut through the outburst like a knife. You will sit down and be silent, or I will hold you in contempt. The court has made its ruling. For a moment, Silas looked like he might argue further. His face was flushed, his hands clenched into fists, but Pemberton grabbed his arm and pulled him back down into his chair, whispering urgently in his ear. Morrison continued, Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order. Mr. Silas Brandt is not to go within 500 yards of Mrs. Eliza Brandt's property or person until this matter is resolved. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. Sheriff Coleman, you'll enforce this order. Yes, Your Honor, Coleman said from the back of the room. This hearing is adjourned. We'll reconvene when the expert analysis is complete. Morrison banged his gavel, and the room erupted in conversation. Jonas turned to Eliza and found her crying silently, tears streaming down her face. But she was smiling too, and she threw her arms around him in a fierce hug that knocked the breath from his lungs. Around them, their neighbors were cheering and clapping, celebrating the small victory. Mrs. Chen appeared beside them, beaming. You did it! You stood up to that snake and you won! We didn't win yet, Jonas cautioned, though he couldn't keep the smile off his face. We just bought time. Time is everything, Gustav Larsen said, clapping Jonas on the back hard enough to make him stagger. Time to find more evidence. Time for Silas to make a mistake. Time for truth to come out. As they made their way out of the town hall, Jonas saw Silas and Pemberton standing near their table. Silas was arguing heatedly with his lawyer, his voice rising despite Pemberton's obvious attempts to calm him down. Jonas caught fragments of the conversation. Told you this would work. How was I supposed to know? 3 weeks is too long. Can't wait that long. Pemberton's response was too quiet to hear, but his body language suggested he was deeply unhappy with his client. As Jonas watched, the lawyer gathered his papers, said something final to Silas, and walked away, leaving Silas standing alone. For a brief moment, Silas's eyes met Jonas's across the room. The hatred there was palpable, a physical thing that made Jonas's skin prickle. Then Silas turned and stalked out of the building through a side door. That man's going to be trouble, Sheriff Coleman said, appearing at Jonas's elbow. The judge gave you 3 weeks. I suggest you use them wisely. Find more evidence, and don't give Silas any opportunities to do something stupid. You think he'll try something? He's desperate and cornered. That's when men are most dangerous. I'll keep a deputy watching your place, at least for the next few days. Coleman tipped his hat to Eliza. You did good today, ma'am. Not many people would stand up to a man like Silas. You should be proud. The ride back to the farm was almost celebratory despite the cold weather. The Hendersons rode alongside their wagon, and Mrs. Chen insisted on coming back to help prepare a proper meal to celebrate. By the time they reached the farm, it felt less like they were returning to a threatened home, and more like they were coming back to a place they'd successfully defended. That night, as Jonas and Eliza sat on the porch after everyone had left, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks before the expert analysis would be complete. 3 weeks before they'd face Silas in court again. Eliza pulled out her slate and wrote, What if the expert says the note is real? Then we find another way to fight, Jonas said. We show that Silas's witness couldn't have been there. We demonstrate his motive. We make such a strong case that the judge has no choice but to side with us. You have so much faith. I have faith in you, Jonas said simply, and in the people who came out today to support us, and in the fact that truth has a way of coming out eventually. Eliza was quiet for a moment, then wrote, I am glad you stayed, glad you did not leave when things got hard. Where else would I go? Jonas asked. This is home now. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange sort of suspended animation. Jonas and Eliza continued working the farm, tending the animals, preparing for winter. The deputy, Tom Reeves, stayed on the property for the first week, then pulled back to occasional patrols once it became clear Silas wasn't going to violate the restraining order immediately. But Jonas could feel the tension building. Silas was still out there, still desperate, still dangerous. And the clock was ticking down to the moment when they'd face him in court again. On the 15th day after the hearing, Jonas was repairing the fence around the vegetable garden when Sheriff Coleman rode up, his face grim. We've got a problem, he said without preamble. Silas left town 2 days ago, told people he was going to Kansas City on business, but I checked with the stage office. He never took the stage. Nobody knows where he went. Jonas felt ice settle in his stomach. You think he's planning something? I think a man who's about to lose everything might do something desperate. I've got deputies watching your place tonight, and I want you to keep that revolver handy. If Silas shows up here, you shoot first and ask questions later. The restraining order gives you that right. Jonas had replaced his lost revolver with a new one bought in Cedar Junction, and he'd taken to wearing it whenever he worked outside. Now he checked it again, making sure it was loaded and ready. That night, Jonas slept in his clothes with the revolver on the floor beside his pallet. Eliza had given him a room in the house now that the barn had burned. It was Daniel's old study, small but private, and it meant Jonas was close if anything happened. The deputy, Tom Reeves, was on the porch with a rifle across his knees. Around 2 a.m, Jonas woke to the smell of smoke. He was on his feet instantly, grabbing his revolver and bursting out of his room. Tom was already moving, pointing toward the new barn. Fire! Someone set fire to the barn again. But this time they were ready. Jonas and Tom ran toward the barn with buckets while Eliza rang the old bell Daniel had installed near the house, the signal they'd arranged with the neighbors in case of emergency. Within minutes, people were arriving from nearby farms, and they formed a bucket brigade from the well to the barn. The fire had been set near the door, but it hadn't had time to spread. They doused it quickly, saving the structure with minimal damage. And as Jonas stood there catching his breath, soot-covered and furious, he saw movement in the darkness beyond the barn. There! He shouted, pointing. Tom raised his rifle and fired a warning shot, and the figure took off running toward where horses were tied in the trees. Jonas ran after them, his longer legs eating up the ground. He could hear Tom behind him, could hear Eliza's bells still ringing, could hear his own blood pounding in his ears. The figure ahead was struggling to mount their horse, moving with desperate clumsiness. Jonas tackled them just as they got 1 foot in the stirrup. They went down hard, rolling in the dirt, and Jonas found himself grappling with Silas Brandt. You! Jonas roared, his hands finding Silas's coat and hauling him up. You tried to burn us out again. Silas's face was wild, desperate. It's mine. That farm should be mine. Eliza should be mine. Daniel had no right. I loved her first. He swung wildly at Jonas, but his punch was weak, panicked. Jonas blocked it easily and threw Silas to the ground, keeping him pinned there until Tom arrived with rope to bind his hands. Sheriff Coleman arrived 20 minutes later with 2 more deputies, having been alerted by the bell and the commotion. He looked at Silas, who was sitting on the ground with his hands tied, rocking back and forth and muttering to himself. Caught him in the act? Coleman asked. Caught him running from the barn after setting fire to it, Jonas confirmed. There are probably a dozen witnesses by now who saw the whole thing. That'll do it. Coleman hauled Silas to his feet. Silas Brandt, you're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and violating a court order. You have the right to, you have the right to a lawyer, though I suspect Mr. Pemberton won't be representing you anymore. As they loaded Silas into the wagon to take him to jail, he looked back at Eliza one last time. It should have been me, he said, his voice breaking. You should have chosen me. Eliza stepped forward and held up her slate, making sure Silas could read it even in the darkness. I chose the better man. Both times. The next morning, the word spread through Cedar Junction like wildfire. Silas Brandt had been arrested, caught in the act of trying to burn down Eliza's barn a second time. The restraining order he'd violated, the attempted arson, the clear evidence of his desperation, all of it combined to paint a picture of a man who'd been lying all along. Judge Morrison, still in town waiting for the expert analysis from Kansas City, called an emergency hearing. This time there was no Pemberton to defend Silas. The lawyer had withdrawn from the case immediately upon hearing of his client's arrest. Morrison listened to Sheriff Coleman's report, heard testimony from Jonas and Tom Reeves about catching Silas at the scene, and reviewed the evidence of the restraining order violation. "Mr. Brandt," the judge said, "your actions last night demonstrate a consciousness of guilt. A man who truly believed in the legitimacy of his claim would have no reason to resort to violence and intimidation. Combined with the questionable witness signature and the circumstantial evidence of forgery, I am ruling in favor of Mrs. Eliza Brandt." He banged his gavel. "The promissory note is deemed fraudulent and unenforceable. The debt claimed against Mrs. Brandt is dismissed in its entirety. Furthermore, Mr. Brandt will face criminal charges for arson, attempted murder, and forgery. This case is closed." The town hall erupted in cheers. Jonas felt Eliza sag against him, all the tension and fear of the past weeks finally draining away. They'd won. Not just a reprieve, not just a delay, but actual victory. Silas was led away in chains, and as he passed their table, he looked at Jonas with hollow eyes. "She was supposed to be mine," he said quietly. "It was all supposed to be mine." "You never deserved her," Jonas said, "and you never will." The weeks after the trial passed in a blur of normalcy that felt almost strange after the chaos. Silas was sentenced to 5 years in prison for arson and forgery. His business in town collapsed, and the property he'd leveraged so heavily was sold to pay his debts. Within a month, it was like he'd never existed in Cedar Junction at all. Jonas and Eliza fell back into the rhythm of farm work, preparing for winter. They repaired the damage to the barn, restocked supplies, and made plans for spring planting. The community that had rallied around them remained close, stopping by regularly to check on them, bringing food and conversation and laughter that filled the house with warmth. One evening in late November, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Jonas was in the barn checking on the animals when Eliza appeared in the doorway. She stood there watching him work, and when he looked up, there was something different in her expression, something soft and hesitant and hopeful. She walked over to him and pulled out her slate, but instead of writing, she pressed it into his hands. He looked down and saw she'd written something earlier, the words carefully formed and underlined. "I am ready to try." "Try what?" Jonas asked, though something in his chest already knew the answer. Eliza pointed at her throat, then at her mouth. She was going to try to speak. Jonas set down the slate carefully and took both her hands in his. "You don't have to," he said gently. "I understand you find the way things are." But she shook her head, her jaw set with determination. She took a deep breath, and Jonas could see the effort it took, the way she had to force her throat to remember how to form sounds it had refused to make for 2 years. She whispered, so quiet Jonas almost didn't hear it. "John." Her voice cracked and she stopped, frustrated tears forming in her eyes. But Jonas squeezed her hands encouragingly. "It's okay. Take your time." She tried again, her whole body trembling with effort. "Jonas." The sound was rough and scratchy from disuse, barely louder than a breath, but it was unmistakably his name. Jonas felt his vision blur with tears. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." Eliza was crying now too, but she wasn't finished. She took another breath and forced out more words, each one clearly costing her tremendous effort. "Thank you for staying." "Oh, Eliza." Jonas pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face against his chest, her shoulders shaking with sobs. But they weren't just tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of release, of healing, of a voice finding its way back after being silenced by grief. They stood there in the barn while snow fell outside, 2 broken people who'd found a way to be whole again. Jonas didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if Eliza would fully recover her voice, or if they'd eventually become something more than partners, or if the farm would thrive or just survive. But he knew this moment was enough. This farm, this woman, this life they'd built together from the wreckage of their separate sorrows, it was enough. After a long moment, Eliza pulled back and looked up at him. She opened her mouth, clearly wanting to say something else, but the words wouldn't come. She reached for her slate instead and wrote, "I wanted to tell you something." "What is it?" She erased and wrote again, her hand steadier now. "This farm is not just yours because you work it. It is yours because you saved it, saved me. Will you stay? Not as hired help, as family." Jonas read the words twice, making sure he understood what she was offering. Family. Not just partnership, not just shared labor and shared land, but something deeper and more permanent. "I'll stay," he said quietly, "as long as you'll have me. This is home now. You're home." Eliza smiled through her tears and wrote one more thing. "Then we start again. Together." The winter that followed was hard, as Kansas winters always were, but the farmhouse stayed warm. Jonas and Eliza worked side by side, planning for spring, repairing equipment, caring for the animals. Eliza practiced speaking a little each day, and slowly, painfully, her voice began to return. Some days she could manage full sentences. Other days, only a word or two. But Jonas never pushed her, never made her feel like she had to speak to be understood. By the time spring arrived and they began preparing the fields for planting, Eliza could hold short conversations, though her voice remained soft and sometimes uncertain. She sang while she worked, quiet songs her mother had taught her, and Jonas thought they were the most beautiful sounds he'd ever heard. One April morning, as they stood looking at the freshly tilled fields ready for seed, Eliza spoke without her slate for the first time in months of conversation. "Jonas," she said, her voice still rough but growing stronger, "do you ever regret it, coming here instead of going back east?" Jonas thought about the man he'd been when he arrived in Cedar Junction, rejected, purposeless, believing he had nothing to offer. He thought about everything that had happened since: the harvest, the fire, the fight with Silas, the community that had embraced them both. He thought about the woman standing beside him, who'd seen something worth saving when everyone else saw only a man too heavy for farm work. "Not once," he said, "not for a single moment." Eliza reached out and took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his large ones. "Good," she said, "because I can't imagine this life without you now." They stood there together as the sun rose over the prairie, illuminating the fields they would plant, the barn they had rebuilt, the house that had become home. In the distance, Jonas could see smoke rising from the Henderson farm, and beyond that, the first buildings of Cedar Junction. This was his place now. These were his people. And the woman beside him, who had spoken for the first time in 2 years to tell him he mattered, was his family. The story of Jonas Keller and Eliza Brandt would be told in Cedar Junction for generations. The rejected mail-order groom and the silent widow who found each other in desperation and built something strong enough to withstand fire, fraud, and fear. People would remember how they'd stood against Silas Brandt, how the community had rallied around them, how love and determination had won over money and malice. But for Jonas and Eliza, it wasn't a story to be told. It was simply their life, beginning again in the Kansas soil they'd both learned to call home. The wheat would grow, the seasons would change, and through it all, they would work side by side, partners in every sense of the word, building a future neither had dared to hope for when they first met on that desperate September day. As they walked back toward the house for breakfast, Eliza spoke again, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I think," she said carefully, "that today will be a good day." Jonas smiled and squeezed her hand. "I think every day is good, as long as we're together." And in the morning light, with the promise of spring all around them, that simple truth felt like enough to last a lifetime. The two HD peoples, www.youtube.com/watch. V3VFSIEZZM5W. Got it. Here's a shorter, cinematic 5-part American-style summary, around 350 words total, keeping all the emotional beats, new character names, and a clean, dramatic arc with a closed ending. Title: The Widow Who Spoke for the First Time. 1. Opening: The Rejected Man. In 1867, Kansas, Jonas Keller, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, was left humiliated at the Cedar Junction station after a widow canceled their mail-order marriage with a cruel telegram. "You're too heavy for farm work." Broken alone, he sat beneath the noon sun until a silent woman, Eliza Brandt, watched him from across the street. She hadn't spoken since fever took her husband and child 2 years ago. Something in the stranger's sadness stirred her heart. 2. Rising Action: A Silent Invitation. Without words, Eliza offered Jonas her embroidered handkerchief, then her hand. He followed her home to a lonely farm surrounded by golden fields. They built an unspoken rhythm. She wrote on a chalk slate. He mended fences and fixed the well. For the first time, both felt useful and less alone. But peace ended when Silas Brandt, Eliza's bitter cousin-in-law, arrived, claiming her husband owed him $500. 3. Climax: The False Claim. Silas's debt papers were forgeries meant to steal her land and force her into marriage. Jonas and Eliza found an old letter proving Silas had once been rejected by her and now sought revenge. When Silas dragged the matter to a public meeting, Jonas stood before the whole town, voice shaking but firm, exposing the truth. The crowd turned against the schemer, and the sheriff seized his papers. Humiliated, Silas fled, vowing revenge. 4. Resolution: The Fire and the Fight. That night, Silas set the barn ablaze. Jonas charged through smoke and flame, fighting him hand to hand until the sheriff's men arrived. Together, the townsfolk helped douse the fire, saving the farmhouse and all that mattered. 5. Breakthrough and Ending: The Voice Returns. As dawn broke, soot-covered Eliza ran to Jonas, trembling. Her lips parted, and for the first time in years her voice emerged. "Don't leave me." Jonas smiled through tears. "You got your voice back." She whispered, "No, you gave it back." The farm stood scorched but alive, reborn with love, and the widow who once lived in silence had finally spoken her heart.